Hello and welcome back to my channel What If Deku 2O. Join us as we delve into the realms of fanfiction and fantasy, bringing you the best stories and discussions. Today, we're kicking off part 8 of our series, What If Deku Unleashed God-like powers surpassing all? If you enjoy this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more content in the future. The author of this story is DripBayless from FanfictionNet. All the relevant links are in the description. Feel free to say hello to the author on their profile. Now, let's dive into the fanfic. Izuku stumbled away from one of the open gyms while blanketed in pink fire. Mirko had not gone easy on him in the slightest, not that he was really expecting her to or even wanted her to. As painful as the spars were, he wouldn't trade them for anything. Not only did he get to fight the friggin' rabbit hero herself, he also got to explore the limits of his power on a person who could take it. His mother taught him how to fight and how to dodge, but Mirko was teaching him how to safely cut loose. The brief thought of his mother brought up another reason he enjoyed the spar: his need to release some of the anger that had been festering within him since finals. A lot of it still remained more than he was really comfortable with acknowledging, but every little bit spent was a great thing in his book, and Mirko was very willing to draw it out of him if it gave her a greater fight. He'd have to do something nice for her the next time she popped up unannounced. In the meantime, Mirko left with Rukiyu to, in her words, do grown-up shit, so he was left to gingerly wander back to the showcase and try to find May and Melissa. He used the opportunity to take in even more of the sights, and he was really grateful to All Might for extending the invitation to him. The way people used their quirks in public so unconsciously was still very jarring to observe. He couldn't help but feel self-conscious when he walked out of the gym with his pink flames still actively healing him. But the fact that no one spared it a glance was so strange and sort of liberating. Maybe that wasn't the best word to use, all things considered. "Midoriya," a familiar voice called out to him, and he turned to see a costumed Ada racing toward him with gusto. "Oh, Ada, I'm glad to see you," Izuku remarked with a smile. "It's good to see you here as well, my friend," Ada responded when he reached him. "I suspected that you would be here given the language Principal Nezu used when he met with us." Izuku nodded, and then something occurred to him. "Where's your brother?" "He's staying at our hotel for the day," he explained. "It's part of our cover. He'll remain out of sight until tomorrow to give the illusion that his procedure was today." "Ah, that makes sense," Izuku replied. "Is anyone else from our class here?" "Surprisingly, yes," Ida answered. "I was just on my way back to them, actually. Come along." David Shield studied the readings appearing on screen from Toshinori's physical assessment. The downward trend in his friend's quirk factor was concerning, but it at least remained a steady decline and hadn't taken a drastic downturn thus far. He wasn't sure how long that would last, though. "Your quirk levels are still on the decline, Toshi. I know your injury was bad, but it shouldn't be hamstringing you this badly," he said while turning to the emaciated man. "I guess hero work degrades your body with age," Toshinori sheepishly coughed. "Quirk factors don't just disappear, though," David insisted. "It's almost as if your quirk was somehow gifted to you as a teenager, and it's finally petering out as your body deteriorates from your injury." Toshinori was sweating bullets at the supposition, but David only sighed and closed his eyes. "No, that would be preposterous. Quirks don't work that way. It has to be something else that's affecting you, but I'm not yet sure what that would even be." Toshinori breathed a sigh of relief at dodging that bullet, but David's mind remained unsettled. At the rate of his decline, All Might would only have so much time left to be an active pro. He already limited his time doing hero work as it stood, but he'd eventually be forced to completely retire in the not-so-distant future. The symbol of peace was the one thing keeping Japan's crime rate at 6% when other nations sported up to 20%, and that important fixture was in danger of disappearing entirely. David would not let that happen. He could not let that happen. This only emboldened his belief that he had to do something to prevent a potentially catastrophic future where All Might was gone. His quirk-boosting headgear would be just the thing All Might needed to continue preserving society. If his bosses wouldn't approve of its production, then he'd damn sure get it out there in spite of them. He didn't like having to stage a villain attack to do it, but it was for the greater good. It's not like he hired actual villains to do the deed. It was all going to be staged, and no one would actually get hurt. Besides, Murphy's Law was only a writing convention, not a scientific principle. Everything was going to be fine. "Oh, there you are," Melissa called out to the approaching Izuku and Ida. "I met some of your classmates." True to her word, Izuku and Ida wandered up to an outdoor cafe table seating Melissa, Ochako, Gyro, and an exhausted Kaminari and Mainta in waitstaff attire. Izuku was surprised to see so many of his classmates present. It felt rather inexplicable for them all to be on the island, but whatever. Ochako was the first to greet them, appearing in front of Izuku in a flash with a box in hand. "Happy early birthday," she shouted and handed him the box with pizzas. "Since the actual date falls during our training camp, I figured I'd just give it to you now while I had the chance." The others in attendance watched curiously as Izuku slowly accepted the box and opened it, and they were even more curious when their class rep's eyes widened. "What do you think it is?" Mainta whispered to Kaminari. "Maybe a stash of sexy pics," Kaminari joked to the shorter boy, and the two snickered until both were smacked across the head with Gyro's jacks. Izuku, meanwhile, pulled out the item in question, a silvery scarf with subtle hints of color throughout. "It's, an iridescent scarf," she sheepishly began to explain. "It's fireproof and is woven with materials that will change color when reacting to heat. Put it on and fire up your quirk." Izuku dutifully did as he was instructed and wrapped the scarf around his neck, silently noting that it complemented the iridescent metal of his gauntlets and leg bracers rather well. When he ignited his quirk, the scarf went up in a myriad of colors alongside him, and Izuku marveled at the sight. "I saved up and commissioned it from a support company that does custom orders," Ochako continued with a light blush. "I figured it would be a good accessory to go with your colorful motif." She didn't get to finish before she was brought into a tight hug by her friend who had thankfully killed his flames by then, and she happily returned the gesture. "Thank you, Ochako," Izuku said sincerely. "Had I known you'd be here, I would have gotten you something, too." "That's not how birthday presents work, and you know that," she giggled, and Izuku merely shrugged. "Wait, how can something be fireproof and still react to heat?" Kaminari questioned. The science behind it is really beyond me," Ochako sheepishly admitted. "It's entirely contradictory," Izuku thought to himself with a chuckle. "Then again, I also wouldn't be able to explain Mr. Aizawa's capture scarf or people with spray bottle nozzles for heads. Rule of cool, I guess." "You all received invitations to the expo?" Izuku asked the group, changing the subject. "We came with Yaemomo," Gyro answered. "Her dad's one of the shareholders for a few of the expo's sponsors, so she got a few plus ones, and we thunderdomed for them." "Oh, cool," Izuku replied. Then it occurred to him that the girl in question wasn't present at the table. "Where is she?" She jerked her thumb behind them to another table, and the first person he spotted was Mei closely analyzing Yayurazu's costume with a notebook in hand. He also saw Shoto sitting at the table, strangely enough. "Shoto's here, too?" he asked, and Gyro nodded. "He said his dad got an invite, but had important business, so he came in his place," she replied with a shrug. "Kirishima and Bakugo are here, too, but they're off somewhere doing who knows what." Izuku nodded and took note of the two engaging in conversation without paying anything else any mind whatsoever, Mei included. "They seem close," he observed. "Been that way since finals," Gyro nodded with a smirk. "She gets all flustered when I ask about it and won't elaborate." Izuku hummed, and a small smile formed at the sight of the two. "Good to know." "It's getting late," Ida spoke up. We should return to our hotel rooms to prepare for the expo reception tonight. We are all representing UA, so we shall go together. The group Shoto and Yaoyorozu included took that as their cue to disperse and prepare, and Melissa and Izuku wrangled Mei away from her scheming. "What were you up to with Yaoyorozu's costume?" Izuku asked her. "Getting that shelf off of her back first and foremost," Mei replied. "One awkward landing and she's crippled." Izuku winced at the thought, as she was completely accurate in her assessment. "Anything else?" Replacing the chemistry dictionary she carries on that shelf with a digital index, probably over a piece of eyewear of some kind. Still working out the specifics. "We can draw something up in my lab before we get ready for the reception if you guys want," Melissa offered, and the words just barely left her mouth before a rabid Mei was tugging her away. "What are we waiting for? Let's go," she excitedly declared, somehow leading the taller girl in the correct direction. Izuku amusedly shook his head and hurried along to catch up with the deceptively fast girl. Upon reaching the I-Island Academy campus, they headed directly to Melissa's own personal research and development lab. The two UA students were floored when they laid eyes on it, but for different reasons. Izuku was in awe of the fact that she was afforded her own lab to study and create in, whereas Mei was salivating at the thought of being able to tinker and experiment without power loader tossing her out for causing too many explosions in a 30-minute span. While the two were looking around, Izuku took stock of the full shelf of trophies and awards that Melissa had. "The grind never stops for you, does it?" "Not a chance," she laughed. "Gotta stay ahead if I want to be a hero." "Wait, like a pro?" Izuku asked, and she shook her head. "Nah, I gave up on that dream a while ago," she replied. "Don't have a quirk, after all." "Oh," Izuku muttered, mildly taken aback by the information. He didn't know what to say to that, and glancing over to Mei only showed that she was gleefully looking over some schematics that Melissa had been working on for various projects. "You don't have to sound so sorrowful," Melissa joked in response. "It's not a disability." Izuku internally scolded himself for reacting in the way that he did, even inadvertently. He faced her and sent her a genuine smile. "No, it absolutely isn't." She returned his smile, and then her smile became a mischievous smirk. "Besides, quirkless is just a word when you're a genius and decently wealthy." Izuku definitely had to concede that point. "Even if I can't be a hero in the traditional sense," she continued, "I can still save lives, just indirectly via quirk research and support equipment, like my dad." She looked over to a framed photo she had of her as a toddler on her father's shoulders. "Even without a powerful quirk, he still does so much good for so many people with his work." "You really look up to him," Izuku commented fondly. Melissa nodded with a smile. "He's my hero. I want to be just like him and protect the world through science. Speaking of..." She beckoned the two into a side room of the lab that stored a plethora of devices. Once both were inside, she retrieved a small chip from her pocket. "Remember the pogo stick?" When they nodded, she let it unfold and expand once again into the functional pogo stick. "I will never get tired of seeing that," Mei muttered. "Well, it was sort of a proof of concept for my magnum opus," Melissa admitted with a smirk before opening a drawer and retrieving a set of boxes. Then she opened a larger drawer near the floor and pulled out a larger case. She opened the smaller boxes and retrieved two red, metallic wristbands before locking them onto her wrists. Upon activation, the wristbands unfolded and expanded in the same fashion as the pogo stick to form a pair of gauntlets over her hands and forearms. "Holy shit," Izuku remarked, and Mei's eyes were practically glimmering. She then opened the larger case to show a sleek, metallic pair of shoes and what appeared to be a metallic bandolier, both the same color as the gauntlets. She slipped the metal footwear over her regular shoes, and they expanded as well into a set of boots that covered up to her knees. When she put on the bandolier, it expanded to become a chest piece that fit snugly over her. The two UA students watched in various states of awe as she grabbed around, flat disc and a helmet that covered all but her face. She placed the helmet on and then applied the disc into a groove in the chest piece before activating it, and the disc began to glow. All at once, the individual pieces expanded again and almost linked together, forming a fully functional power suit. A transparent, protective mask slid over her face, and she gave the two a triumphant grin. "Ain't she a beaut?" she smugly presented herself. Two things happened next. First, Mei and Izuku flew into a frenzy of analysis on the suit, with Izuku's hair erupting with white flames. The two bombarded her with questions ranging from how the suit was powered, what features it came with, if it could fly, if it blew things up, etc. Then, a jolt of pain shot through Izuku's head, and he promptly blacked out and dropped to the floor like a sack of potatoes. Inko stepped through the door of their apartment with a sigh. The meeting with Nezu and Endeavor had gone well enough, but calling it emotionally draining would have been a gross understatement. She never would have expected the Flame Hero to admit his wrongdoings on his own volition, nor would she have ever expected him to agree to go public with it. Granted, had the HPSC not threatened him, he probably wouldn't have, but she reasoned that progress was progress. Regardless, it was a lot to think about, so she would rather table it now that she was home again. She was grateful that the Big Three happened to be on campus for a training session after the meeting concluded, as a spar was exactly what she needed. She really adored those three, especially Tagada's unflinching positivity and Hato's boundless curiosity. She'd have to do something about Amajiki's confidence, though. He was a really sweet boy. She moved her mind elsewhere before she could go off on another mental tangent, and she entered her living room and plopped onto her couch, not even bothering to remove her costume just yet. Her son was hopefully having fun on his trip to Island, and she was exhausted, so she'd take advantage of being home alone and melt into her couch for a bit. She turned on the TV and exhaled the day away, slightly turning her head to the wall where their family photos and her Chinese evergreen plant rested. That's when she noticed it. It was very subtle, and most people likely would have missed it entirely, but something about the red leaves in her plant felt off. The tension in her body returned, and she got up to inspect the plant a little closer. Her paranoia had been honed and sharpened into a blade, and she made sure to pass that paranoia onto her son. And she knew where everything in her home was just in case she needed to use her quirk on an intruder. So when something was amiss about something in her home, while her son wasn't around to have touched anything, it was time to be on edge. A closer inspection of the plant confirmed her suspicions. Nestled rather inconspicuously among the red leaves of the plant was something that was decidedly not a leaf. She gently picked it up between her index finger and thumb and held it up to her face. It was a feather, a lone, red feather. Only one person had feathers like that, and it was the current No. 3 Pro hero, Hawks. It was also an open secret that he was trained by and worked directly for the Hero Public Safety Commission as part of their program to create the perfect little minions. Exactly how long had the feather been there? She noticed it quickly enough when she glanced in the plant's direction. But that didn't necessarily mean that it hadn't escaped her notice previously. It could have been there for who knows how long without her realizing it, and this could have just been the first time she paid attention to it. That wasn't even the most important question, either. Why was it here? Clearly, he had been inside her home, but why leave the feather? Was it a warning in a similar vein to Endeavor's? If so, why try to hide it amongst red leaves? Why leave a warning at all if it wasn't meant to be seen? Logically, it probably wasn't a warning. She wasn't Endeavor. They wouldn't feel the need to give her any advance warning if they had any intentions of taking action against her or her son. So, the more likely option was that Hawk's feathers did more than just fly and pierce things. Being remote explosives felt a tad far-fetched, so maybe they could also be used for surveillance. That was more plausible and would be more along the lines of the Commission's Mo. Maybe he could hear through the feathers, and he placed the feather there to pick up on their conversations. Regardless of how they were going about it, the irrefutable fact was that Hawks was in her home, meaning the Commission was in her home. They were using the No. 3 hero to surveil her family without their knowledge. That was absolutely not going to fly. She placed the feather back in the plant to not tip Hawks off that she knew about it, and she immediately texted Nezu. There were now 2 heroes in the top 10 on her kill list. Izuku groaned and groggily opened his eyes to see the concerned faces of Mei and Melissa above him. "You okay, Muscles?" Mei asked as she and Melissa helped him sit up. "Yeah," Izuku groaned. "My head just went a little haywire just now. Not sure why." "Your hair combusted when you saw the suit," Melissa commented with worry still in her voice. "The fire was white. Is that normal?" Izuku's eyes briefly widened at the revelation. "It's part of my quirk. It's pretty much an intelligence buff, but it strains my brain after using it for too long." He frowned, thinking back to the day at the mall when he got a mild headache from briefly using the flames after his talk with Tamura Shigaraki. Or, at least, it should have only done so after using it for too long. It can sometimes activate on its own when I'm excitedly curious, but it hasn't put me down that quickly in years. "How often do you use it?" Mei asked. "Admittedly, not very often anymore," Izuku sheepishly admitted. "I haven't really had a reason to, and after I nearly liquefied my brain during the cavalry battle at the sports festival, I tried to keep away from it." "Well, there you go," Mei nodded. "Quirks are like muscles. If you don't use them, you lose them." "But for it to degrade that quickly is odd," Melissa mused. "It shouldn't revert so drastically after only a few months of disuse. I'd offer to run some tests on your body, but I'm not sure we have time before the reception tonight." "We can get around to that tomorrow or some other time before the expo is over," Izuku agreed. "We should get ready for the reception." "The guards are taken care of, boss," spoke a man with shoulder-length, dull pink hair into a walkie-talkie as a closet full of bound and gagged guards was shut. "Everyone is in position." "Excellent," replied a gruff voice from the other end. "Keep them bound, but don't kill them. No sense in blowing our true cover too soon. Let's move." Little did they know that they were already down a member. Disposed of in a shipping container in Gate 66 was the bloody body of one of Wolfram's own men, stripped of his clothes and riddled with large, circular puncture wounds. The uniform and mask he was wearing were currently being donned by someone else entirely. Izuku and Mei entered the lobby after the designated meeting time that Ida had declared, much to the taller boy's chagrin. They weren't the only ones, either, as just about everyone was tardy for one reason or another. One person who was on time was Mainta, and his gaze instantly traveled to Mei beside Izuku, or, more accurately, the dress she was wearing that did wonders in showing off her particularly bountiful assets in Mainta's esteemed opinion. Fortunately for him, Mei hadn't noticed him staring. Unfortunately for him, Izuku had. An almost paralyzing chill ran up the diminutive boy's spine, and his gaze shifted over to the boy beside her. His eyes were met with a slitted, heterochromatic pair surrounded by small, blue flames adorning the face of his class rep. Then they were gone and his eyes were back to their typical green, almost as if nothing was ever amiss in the first place. The point had certainly gotten across, though. He would behave or there would be consequences. He was lucky enough to not receive any official consequences after the stunt in the locker room as it was. He would like to believe that his fellow guys didn't want to sell him down the river for it. In actuality, however, the possibility of Gyro getting expelled for potentially committing attempted murder on Mainta had Ida not blocked the hole with his hand, and the fact that Izuku healed Ida's hand anyway kept them from saying anything, and they told him as much. Mainta would be lying if he said that losing the respect of most of his classmates, provided he had much to begin with, didn't make him feel pretty terrible. Meanwhile, Izuku was satisfied with his classmate averting his gaze. Mei had confided in him on the way to the reception that she never got dressed up in anything more formal than a school uniform, and doing so for a fancy reception was a peculiar experience. She even remarked about not having any pockets to hold the multi-tool she took with her everywhere in case of emergency tinkering. so she just stuffed it under her goggles. Izuku wasn't going to allow his dangerously horny classmate to make her more uncomfortable than she already was. Once everyone had arrived to the lobby of the building, however, an alert blared across the island. "Thank you for inviting me. It's truly a pleasure to be here," All Might said on stage to the collection of heroes, engineers, quirk scientists, and shareholders attending the reception. Just then, the screen behind All Might switched from the iExpo graphic to a warning signal. Across the island, an automated announcement was made informing the populace of a bomb being discovered, and that the island was going into high alert. It was a strange occurrence for those who lived on the island, as that wasn't the typical protocol for bomb threats. Those who didn't were surprised and alarmed, but they followed along with the given instructions. Well, almost everyone. "A bomb," Mirko mused quizzically while she and Rukiyu were heading back to their hotel. "Sounds serious," Rukiyu replied as the security sentries entered the streets in full force. Rukiyu looked over to her friend, and she did not like the gleam in her eyes, nor did she like the feral grin that came over her. "Let's go find it." "Not a chance, Rumi." "Come on, we're pros. What else do we do in this situation?" Let the obscenely high-tech security measures do their jobs on the obscenely high-tech island. But they're not nearly as fast as we are, and they definitely don't look as strong. Say the bomb is stowed away in a populated area and civilians need to be rescued. Who better than us two to assist? Ryukyu begrudgingly could not argue against that. "I just know I'm going to regret going along with this," Ryukyu sighed. "Awesome. I'm calling in backup," Mirko cheered while pulling out her phone. "Wait, what?" Ryukyu choked out. "Who?" "You'll see," she snickered as she called her newest favorite sparring partner. Hello? Little Green, do you know how to defuse a bomb?" "Why would I know how to do that, Mirko?" "But you could at least cover it with your orange barriers to mitigate any explosions or protect anyone in the blast zone, right?" "Theoretically, yeah." "Great. Keep your location on. We'll come find you." "Wait, what? Click. Izuku put away his phone with a slightly disconcerted expression, but he put that aside for the moment and focused on the shicho before him. He was crouching beside Gyro, who had one of her jacks plugged into the floor to hear what was going on down in the ballroom. What she picked up only filled her with dread. A group of villains took over the tower and put the island on lockdown, Gyro relayed to him with the rest of the group listening in. They have the security drones holding civilians hostage, and they subdued all of the pros in the room, including All Might. Everyone tensed at that, the idea of All Might being subdued by anyone filling them all with dread as well. "What do they want?" Izuku asked. "I'm not sure," Gyro answered. "The leader didn't say. He did send Professor Shield and another researcher off with one of his flunkies, though, so they're probably after something specific. Maybe an invention." "Or research," Izuku mused with a frown, and Melissa's eyes widened. The villains could be after any number of things regarding her father's research, but it was also very possible that they were after whatever he had been pouring his time and energy into recently that he wouldn't even give her too many details about. This was bad. "We have to do something," Melissa nearly pleaded. "My dad's in danger." "We cannot act against these villains. It would be too dangerous," Ida spoke up. "I must agree," Yayurazu added with a downcast sigh. "We don't have our hero licenses, yet. We can't fight them." "That hasn't stopped us before," Shoto rebutted, and Ida stiffened at the reminder. "Is it really okay for us to just do nothing?" A brief, albeit tense silence fell over the group, and Ochako could only look at the pensive faces of her classmates. Then she looked to Izuku glaring a hole down at the villains in the ballroom. One look at his face showed her a burning determination to help people in need that she was so familiar with. However, behind that fiery desire was a contained fury that she wasn't so familiar with. "You're going to do something about it with or without us, aren't you, Izuku?" she asked him. "Pretty much," he responded without looking back up at them. There are people down there who need help, and we're in a position to do that. We're heroes, license or not, this is what we do. You want to go down there and fight those villains? Mainta cried. Have you learned nothing from the Asti? Immediately as the words left his mouth, he flinched and regretted saying them. The Ust was a horrifying experience for everyone in the class, but everyone had it at differing degrees, none more so than Izuku. Mainta wasn't forced to kill a villain at the Ust, and he hoped he would never find himself in that situation like his classmate had. Izuku, meanwhile, didn't immediately respond, and Mainta was worried that he had seriously crossed a line. Then Izuku finally spoke. No, I haven't forgotten. I think about it every night, actually. Mainta felt even worse until he finally turned to look at them with a smirk. That's the beautiful thing, though, Izuku continued. You all don't have to fight them. You just have to find the security system of the tower and deactivate it. That's easier said than done, dude, Kaminari replied. How would we even find it in order to do that? I know where it is, Melissa spoke up, drawing their attention. It's on the top floor of the tower. If these villains were able to activate the highest security measures, then they were more than likely able to disable the authenticators and passcodes. We could restart the system if we get up there. We'll just have to stay off their radar along the way. Sure, but how do we do that without being discovered? Gyro asked. If they haven't discovered us yet, they probably don't know how the system properly functions, May supplied, and Melissa nodded. I'm in, Ochako declared. I won't sit around and do nothing when we could all be doing something to help. I'm in as well, Shoto added, and the dominoes fell until everyone was in agreement to make the journey. Then, something his green-haired friend said earlier stood out to him, and he turned to address him. Midoriya, what did you mean when you said, you all? You all go on ahead, Izuku confirmed. I'm not particularly interested in doing Die Hard today. Die Hard? Seriously? Gyro questioned with a hint of annoyance. It's my mom's favorite pre-quirk Christmas movie, Izuku shrugged. Die Hard isn't a Christmas movie, dude, Gyro responded in a manner that was somehow deadpan and incredulous simultaneously. Yes, it is, he defended. No, it's not, Melissa spoke up. Yes, it is. Melissa, does it take place during Christmas? Yes, but that doesn't. Is the fact that it takes place during Christmas integral to the plot? Ugh, yes, but then how is it not a Christmas movie? It embodies nothing about the spirit of Christmas, Gyro refuted. What's more Christian than taking down terrorists, Izuku rebutted, and Gyro's right eye began to twitch. There truly must be a better time for this discussion, Ida exasperatedly cut in. The arguing teens paused at their friend's words, and they each deflated. Ida's right, Izuku sighed before fixing the apparent ringleader with a hard glare. I'll keep this Kolkwaffle busy while you guys deactivate the security measures. If he can sick the security drones on civilians with a command, then I'll destroy his earpiece and his ability to give any commands, making your trek up to the top floor a lot less precarious. You're going all alone? Both Ochako and Gyro questioned with worry. I've been needing to vent some frustrations lately, and this asshole kindly volunteered himself for the job, was all Izuku responded with before leaping into action. Gyro wanted to protest, but she decided it was better to let her class rep do his thing. The kid was ridiculously powerful, and she inadvertently caught a bit of the conversation between him and Bakugo right after finals. She didn't have any context, but she could glean that someone Izuku knew and cared about was in some kind of distress, and if that was the case, she totally understood needing to blow off some steam. She silently wished him luck and headed off toward the others, tugging Ochako along with her when she stood in place as her best friend left to fight. Izuku, meanwhile, lit his arms up in purple flames after hopping over the rail and into the ballroom. While in the air, he prepared himself to send out a wave of purple vines to rip the guns out of the grasps of the henchmen with his left arm. All the while his hair went up in white flames and the rest of his body went up in yellow. The two flames mingled on his head, and time seemingly slowed down just like at the sports festival. While his left arm was primed to strike at the henchman, he positioned his right arm toward the ringleader and pointed his index finger at the man's head, making completely sure that he had the perfect angle. When his head began to hurt again, he cut the flames, and his perception of time returned to normal. It all happened in an instant. A wave of thin, purple flames shot out of his left arm and snaked around the guns, while an even thinner purple flame shot out of his right index finger and stabbed into Wolfram's left ear, destroying the communicator entirely without harming him too badly. The moment he landed, his body was bathed in yellow once more, and he shot throughout the room like a pinball to knock out each of the newly weaponless henchmen. Wolfram just barely caught on to what was happening before the yellow blur shot in his direction. But he didn't have enough time to do anything before a golden fist slammed into his face and shattered his mask. While the mask helped mitigate some of the impact, Wolfram was still blasted across the room with a loud crash. "Young Midoriya," All Might shouted in surprise and alarm. The other bound heroes were alarmed as well, but they all noticed that Izuku had eliminated almost every threat in the room with a single attack. They still couldn't move, but the hostages were no longer at gunpoint. Speaking of hostages, Wolfram was beyond pissed that some little upstart had decided to be a hero. He was incensed, however, that the little shit practically succeeded by wasting his gunmen in a literal flash. He wouldn't let that stand, and he would rub the kid's stupidity in his face by ordering civilians to be slaughtered just before he killed the brat. There was one problem with that, though. "What happened to my communicator?" he seethed when he felt the destroyed earpiece. He then thought back to the strange, brief feeling of something shoving into his left ear, and he snarled at the teen. "Was that your punk ass doing, too?" "Might have been. What you gonna do about it, bitch?" He had spent way too much time sparring with Mirko. "Young Midoriya," All Might shouted again, this time more aghast at the vulgar taunt than in surprise or worry about his presence. "Don't worry, I killed his communicator," Izuku assured without taking his eyes off of Wolfram. "He's not giving any orders to anyone anymore, and the rest of us are making our way to the top floor to shut off the hijacked security system." His voice took on a much darker edge. "As of right now, he's stuck on an island with me, and I've got a lot of shit I need to work through." "You'll have plenty of time to work through it in hell, boy," Wolfram growled before All Might could respond. "And you'll be able to give me a tour when I meet you there," Izuku replied in a frigid tone that contrasted the green flames that engulfed him. Wolfram snarled, and a thick pillar made of metal burst from the wall behind him and shot at Izuku. But the boy merely punched it and darted forward, practically carving through it with his arm on his way to beat the dogshit out of Wolfram. The man in question, absolutely gobsmacked by the feat, was helpless when the boy reached him and backhanded him through one of the newly reinforced windows, and Izuku darted out of the building after him. The room was left in silence after the display as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. A teen, likely a hero student, had just defused a hostage situation and neutralized part of the perpetrator's control over the situation in an instant, not to mention his vicious display of strength and speed shortly thereafter. Then there was the fact that All Might seem to be familiar with him. Each of the pro's thoughts could be summed up in one sentence. "That's bad right there," one of the bound pros casually remarked. "Right? And he's so young," another added, and the tension previously engulfing the room appeared to vanish as conversation flitted about and the hostages searched for things to restrain the unconscious henchman with. All Might laid on the floor in his bindings while fighting to maintain his buff form and not blow his cover. All the while, he couldn't help but agree with the sentiments of the other pros. So young, indeed. After being batted out of the building, Wolfram crash-landed on a nearby roof with an unforgiving skid. Unfortunately for him, Izuku was following closely behind him, and he looked to be gearing up for a vicious punch that Wolfram wanted absolutely nothing to do with. The man sent a wave of pillars at him from the metal of the building he was standing on, and Izuku merely bounded through and around the wave with such ease that chipped away at the confidence he initially had about killing the boy. He poured his energy into his quirk and shot even more pillars at Izuku. But the teen wasn't deterred in the slightest and dodged, blocked, and smashed through the oncoming metal like a bat out of hell. Wolfram was only afforded a half-second once Izuku landed to ponder the decisions that led him to this moment before the hardest punch he had ever received slammed into his gut and practically blasted him off of the roof entirely. There was no further reprieve, as Izuku chased after him and unloaded a flurry of blows onto the man while he was still in flight, ending with a stiff kick to his ribs that shot him down towards the concrete of the street. Unfortunately for Wolfram, he would not be saved by the loving embrace of death today. Long before he could hit the ground, he was wrapped up in purple flames and flung back into the air towards another roof. Izuku, anchoring himself to the side of a building with purple spikes in one hand and holding on to Wolfram in the other, spun the man around like a lasso and slammed him to the roof of the newest building. Then, he altered the properties of the spikes to make them elastic enough for him to slingshot himself into the air and rolling into a series of flips that ended with him coming down with an axe kick. "Luna Inferno," he bellowed with his leg shining a positively venomous malachite, driving it down into the prone man with such force that it drove him through the roof and into the top floor of the building. Wolfram truly did not know what horrendous evils he perpetrated in a previous life to earn him a mauling such as this from a feral teenager. Had he not activated the secret muscle augmentation quirk he received from All for One, he almost certainly would have been in the medical ward of a prison for months. He turned his head in the rubble to look at the boy, and one glance into his eyes introduced him to a well of raging fury at a level that he had only last seen in his father when he broke into the man's liquor cabinet and broke both of his arms, falling down the stairs in the aftermath. He could even swear that there were prominent flickers of black filling up the boy's green, hate-filled gaze. Izuku, on the other hand, wasn't even seeing Wolfram as he glared down at him. All he saw was the piece of trash that hurt his mother and the bureaucratic collection of filth that covered for him and so many other pieces of trash. He would savor every second of the retribution he'd unleash upon them. He'd watch them burn with a smile. You don't mess with a Shimura, after all. Wolfram, on the other hand, refused to be a casualty of whatever baggage this freak of nature needed to resolve. He capitalized on the momentary pause the boy seemed to take to savor the punishment he was inflicting, and he leaped to his feet to snatch the boy by the face with his muscle augmentation still active, and he threw him back out of the building as hard as he could. Izuku wasn't expecting such a sudden feat of strength from him, and he cursed himself for forgetting where he was and letting his emotions get the better of him. He regained his bearings and landed on yet another roof. But before he could resolve to not make that mistake again, Wolfram landed right in front of him and punched him with such force that it almost felt as though he was battling Mirko again. It wasn't nearly as hard as the punches from the Namu at the USJ, but it was more than enough to send him careening across the roof and nearly sliding off the edge of it. "You like it?" Wolfram mocked with a smirk. "It's something special I got from All for One. I was saving it for if I had to kill the symbol of peace, but you're no ordinary boy." If he said anything after that, Izuku didn't hear it. The only thing bouncing through his ears was, "It's something special I got from All for One." This man got a quirk from All for One. This man had associated with All for One. Now, not only was he seeing his mother's old teacher and the HPSC, he was seeing All for One, the blight on humanity that forced his grandmother to give up his mother and uncle before ruthlessly killing her. Something within him snapped. As Wolfram took a few more steps toward the boy, a wave of unbearable heat blasted at him mere milliseconds before Izuku erupted in a tower of black fire. Wolfram had to shield his face from the sight. The flames were a bottomless abyss that was simultaneously blinding. He looked away from the utter contradiction for a brief moment before his survival instincts kicked in, and he dropped to put up a thick wall of metal that blocked the pitch-black inferno sent at him. Wolfram would have moved back to attack, but he was transfixed by the way the metal wall started to melt under the heat. Only then did he notice just how ridiculously hot the area had become, and he scrambled away to safety. But the heat was unyielding no matter how far he went. One chance glance at the teen struck him with a sight he'd remember for the rest of his life. The previously clothed teen was standing in a pit of black fire that incinerated everything in sight. Blood cascaded down his form from his quickly burning skin, creating a haunting mixture of dark red and pitch black that was punctuated with glowing green eyes holding nothing but the purest of malice the man had ever seen. Wolfram hadn't felt true fear in a very long time, but his pants certainly got a little heavier in that moment. Then, the quickly fleeting pain resulting from his nerves being cooked alive snapped Izuku out of his stupor, and he snapped back to reality with a gasp. The black flames died out, and Izuku fell to his knees. He looked down at his bloody hands in horror. His skin was absolutely ravaged. He had forgotten everything around him, and that was a costly mistake as Wolfram slammed a fist into his face and sent him crashing into the empty street. His already raw skin was ruined even further, but before he could move a muscle, he was wrapped in pipes from the sewer system and trapped in place. Wolfram quickly made his way to the boy with purpose. The kid was scarily powerful as it was, but that display with the black fire was way too frightening to mess around with. He needed to kill this kid, and he needed to do it quickly. Izuku didn't even register the man's approach. Truthfully, he wasn't registering anything at all. He had lost control, and he tore his body apart as a result. The blackness that he had been avoiding for so many months had nearly consumed him in a single moment. He only just barely had the wherewithal to pull himself out of it. He just barely made out a large shape hovering above him before his vision returned to focus, and he was met with the sight of Wolfram's boot poised to stomp his cranium into the pavement. However, something slammed into the man before he could finish him off, and he was sent careening into metal plating covering a nearby building. Izuku craned his head to see Mirko standing protectively over him, looking as if she was ready to maul anything and everything that approached him. Then she turned her furious, red gaze down at him, and her eyes narrowed upon taking in his bloody form. She kneeled down and gave him the most comforting face she could, which for a pissed-off Mirko was only a slightly less threatening glare. "Did he do this to you?" she asked in a soft tone that wildly contradicted the furious expression she wore. Izuku neither responded nor nodded since the man technically hadn't been the culprit, but Mirko was convinced enough to return an utterly murderous gaze back onto the man who was pulling himself out of the metal of the building. Only then did Izuku notice the massive dragon that was Rukyu hovering dangerously above the man. Meanwhile, Wolfram had briefly made it back to his feet before bending over to hack up a glob of blood. He had never been kicked that hard in his life. First, he had to deal with the angry teenager who could carve through metal and his abdomen with a punch, and now he had to deal with an even angrier-looking woman with rabbit ears that could probably shatter his entire skeleton at once with a single kick regardless of his muscle augmentation. Then there was the elephant in the room, or rather, the dragon in the air above him. The worst part was that he didn't even have the quirk amplifier that he had gone to all this trouble to steal in the first place. The whole plan was truly a shitshow and a half. He just hoped that Swordkill or anyone else could retrieve it and escape, because it didn't look like he would. He was dragged out of his musings by a vicious kick to the sternum from the rabbit hero, launching him into the awaiting claw of the dragoon hero, only to immediately be slammed into the pavement and pinned under the weight of her claws. He used the strength gifted to him by the supervillain to slowly pry the dragon's hand off of him. But a lunar fall from Mirko slammed him back to the ground with another glob of blood escaping his mouth. With his hands pinned to the ground, he sent a wave of metal pillars up to attack and knock the dragon woman off of him, but they only offered a second's reprieve before she tore through them. At that point, Wolfram was exhausted. He could only sigh and resign himself to the ass whooping he was sure to receive. And what an ass whooping it was. Izuku watched the man be viciously torn apart by the two pro-heroines. somewhere between Mirko kicking him up into the air towards Rukyu only for her to whack him back to the ground with her tail, and the two women juggling the man amongst each other like a hacky sack, Izuku felt stable enough to bathe himself in his pink flames. He knew that healing his burns would take quite a while, just as they had when small patches of black flames snuck into his green flames at the Ustya. So he sighed and got comfortable in his little nook in the street while the two women eviscerated the villain and his quirk did its job as best as it could. He hoped that the others were doing okay. The others were, in fact, not doing okay. The group had split up in increments to deal with the various threats they encountered, from wandering villains to a legion of security sentries. Eventually, it came down to May and Melissa, and they were hurrying through the halls and nearing the top floor until they were nearly sliced in half by a furious man with pink hair. "You little gremlins have caused us way too much trouble," the man growled. "Bad enough the boss has been offline for 20 minutes. Now you are ruining." His rant was cut short when a strange-looking red pogo stick entered his vision before unconsciousness took him. Standing over him was May with the pogo stick in hand, having just whacked the man in the head with it after dislodging its chip state from one of the straps of her dress. Melissa looked at her with a mixture of shock, gratitude, and mild annoyance. Noticing the other girl's stare, May shrugged. "I snagged it while Izuku was passed out. I'd apologize, but I know you'd do the same." "Damn right, I would," Melissa said with a smirk. "Let's keep going. We're almost there." The two inventors hurried along with their goal very nearly in sight, traveling down the last few sets of hallways until they passed a massive vault room. Melissa wouldn't have stopped, but she heard the familiar voices of her father and his lead researcher, Samuel. "I've unlocked it. Block 147, David called to Samuel. "Wonderful," Samuel responded and quickly ran to the newly appearing locked box. Opening it up, he gleefully retrieved a case and presented it to David. "We did it, Professor." "Finally, I've got it back," he breathed out while gazing at his magnum opus. "All that research, and they just took it from me. But now I have it back in my hands." "Our plan worked perfectly, and it looks like the villains are holding things down," Samuel said with a nod to the masked man standing off to the side that escorted them up to the vault. "Papa," Melissa muttered in shock, and it got the attention of the three men in the room who turned to see her standing beside an equally shocked May. "Melissa," he said in growing horror, "what are you doing up here?" "Is what he said true?" she questioned in a low, disbelieving tone. "Did you plan all of this, just to steal something?" David did not respond, nor did the other two men beside him. "Answer me," she cried. "Is it true?" More silence was the only response she got. David shamefully looked to the ground, and Samuel looked at anything but the girl in front of them. "Please, say something." "Yes, it's true," her father finally answered, and she had to fight back a horrified sob. "The professor is only trying to get back what was stolen from him," Samuel hurried to explain. "This device can amplify quirks." "So, it's Trigger but in helmet form?" May questioned with narrowed eyes. No, Samuel denied. "Unlike drugs, this could magnify a person's quirk without doing any damage to their body or brain. But our sponsors confiscated the prototype and our research data, and they demanded that we kill the project. They feared that something as revolutionary as this would upheave superhuman society. So the governments of multiple nations pressured your father to abandon the project to avoid widespread chaos. That's why we did this." You pulled the strings on this attack from the beginning?" Melissa choked out with May's fists tightening behind her. "Why? Why would you do this?" "I had to." "You put so many lives in danger. For what?" "I had to save All Might." Melissa was struck silent at that, as she had no idea what All Might had to do with any of this. May, however, had her narrowed gaze on the masked man standing off to the side. He hadn't spoken or moved a muscle the entire time, but he didn't look relaxed. She zoomed in on him and could see the subtle signs in his posture that he was tense, as if he was waiting to strike. She didn't quite believe that the people attacking the expo were entirely actors. All Might's quirk is disappearing. Melissa, her father pleaded. If he uses this device, he'll be back to his old self. No, he'll be even greater. The symbol of peace would never dim. He could keep saving people just like he always has, and society wouldn't crumble in his absence. He took the case from Samuel and manically clutched it to his chest. Please, just let me get this device to All Might. I don't care what punishment I receive after that. Throw me in prison, strip me of my accolades. Just let me save All Might. Yeah, about that, the masked henchman finally spoke up, garnering the attention of the room as he removed his helmet. What was revealed underneath was chin length, crimson hair, and two violet eyes lazily observing the group. Then, a golden chain with a pointed tip shot out of the man's midsection and stabbed through David's bicep, forcing him to drop the case with a cry of pain. Another chain shot out of him to catch the case and bring it over to him, and the redhead took the case into his grasp. "What are you doing?" Samuel shouted. "You're actors. You're not really stealing the device." The man gave Samuel a dry chuckle before 3 more chains lashed out faster than anyone could react and pierced the rotund man through his chest, much to the growing horror of David and Melissa. "That's the funny thing about all of this," the man began as he retracted the chains and Samuel fell to the ground with a thud. "The guys you hired weren't actually actors. They were planning on stealing the device from the start. What they were going to do with it, I have no idea. But it doesn't matter now because I'm not even one of the guys you hired." The way the man spoke so casually about it all while his partner and friend was bleeding out beside him unnerved David to his core. It almost prevented him from standing up to confront him. Almost. "You son of a bitch," David growled, but before he could take another step, a final chain lashed out and stabbed him in the thigh, sending him to the ground to the tune of his daughter's screams. "I missed your femoral artery," the redhead informed in the same casual manner. "Stand down, shield. You've outlived your usefulness, so don't push your luck any further than you already have with this whole stunt. Whether or not your daughter becomes an orphan tonight doesn't really matter to me one way or the other." With that, he turned and walked away from the 2 bleeding men. Melissa, tears cascading down her cheeks from the sight, made to rush to her father's side while the man was passing by. But she felt May's hand locked tightly around her wrist to keep her in place. When she looked down at the girl, she saw May glaring dangerously at the approaching assailant, but she wasn't moving a muscle. The man in question watched on in mild amusement as he casually strolled by the 2 girls. "Smart. You do have quite the brain on you, Miss Hatsune." May did not flinch even a millimeter when he revealed that he knew her name, only keeping her glare on him and her grip on the trembling Melissa. The man seemed to find that equally amusing and worthy of his respect, and he continued on with a light chuckle. "By the way," he spoke as he was leaving the room, "if you want to disable the security system, no one is manning the control center. You won't find me by the time the pros are free anyway." He turned his head to give them one last look, and the mirth dancing about his violet eyes put the 2 even further on edge than anything up to that point. "For your sake, you won't." With that, the man turned the corner and strolled away. Melissa released the sob she was holding in, and she hurried over to her father. "Papa," she choked out to the bleeding man below her. He attempted to offer her a smile in an attempt to reassure her, but it came out as nothing more than a pained grimace. "Hey," May said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I got this. Take down the security system. Save the building. I'll save your dad." Melissa looked at her through teary eyes, and May nodded to reassure her that they could both do it. Melissa nodded in return, and she hurried out of the vault. May quickly removed the multi-tool from under her goggles and used one of the blades to cut strips from the bottom of her dress to fashion tourniquets for his thigh and arm. "You have medic training?" David asked the girl as she worked, and she shrugged. "My mom was an EMT before she joined a cult." David did not respond to that, and May did not elaborate any further. When she was finished applying them, she looked to the larger man. but he was dangerously pale. "Samuel, how is he?" David asked her, fearing the worst from the brief alarm that showed on her face before she got a hold of it. "It's not good," she replied before placing 2 fingers to his jugular, and her expression became solemn. "No pulse," she informed him, and David placed his head in his hands, letting loose a wail of grief into them. This is all my fault," David despaired in the floor beside his friend's body, tears pouring down his face. I went along with this foolish scheme, and he... The man continued his pained wailing, both at the loss of his friend and the loss of all of their hard work. May wasn't going to lie to him by assuring him otherwise, so she kept quiet. Island's security system is now operating in normal mode. At the announcement, the redhead casually wandered through the newly opened security doors and down the emergency stairwell. Along the way, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone before calling in to report the success of his mission. "Skeptic, this is Kusari. The job is complete." "Excellent work as always, Kusari. The Grand Commander will be pleased with your results. Now, hurry back to Japan before the League starts asking questions." "Understood." Mirko and Rukiu stood over the positively mangled body of Wolfram. He was very much alive, but breathing without pain would be next to impossible for him for the foreseeable future. Izuku, having freed himself of his metal bindings and healed his body enough to stop the bleeding and walk without too much trouble, meandered over to the heroine duo and peered down at the unconscious man. "You all right, kid?" Mirko asked him with a level of concern that he didn't even know she was capable of. "Yeah," he muttered with a nod. "What happened before we got here?" Rukiu asked him. "I don't think he was capable of doing that level of damage to you. Those were really bad burns. They still kind of are." "He didn't do it," Izuku admitted with a sigh. "I lost control of my quirk." Mirko frowned at that. "But aren't you practically fireproof?" "Only mostly," he simply responded. Mirko wanted to press the subject, but Rukiu grabbed her shoulder to encourage her not to. Izuku didn't appear to want to discuss the specifics right that moment, so she reluctantly relented. "Ha ha ha," came a boisterous laugh from above, and the familiar red, white, yellow, and blue figure of the symbol of peace landed before them. "I am..." "Late," Mirko interrupted. "You are late. The 3 of us already took care of it." "3?" was the simultaneous thought of Izuku and Rukiu, and they turned to look at her. "What?" she asked. "The kid softened him up big time before we got here. The 2 of us just did cleanup duty, even if there was a pretty big mess to clean up." That wasn't how Izuku would describe what happened whatsoever, but he would be lying if he said the acknowledgement didn't nearly make him choke up, even if it came in the most backhanded, Mirko way possible. Rukiu only nodded in assent and sent the boy a proud smile, which only made it more difficult for him to keep the happy tears in. All Might, too, was a bit struck by the declaration. Watching the rabbit hero take the boy into a headlock and ruffle his hair with her fist while he gingerly tried to escape her grasp, and the dragoon hero watched amusedly beside them, filled the man's heart with something akin to satisfaction. Such youth, he mused to himself upon remembering young Midoriya's grand entrance to the ballroom and handling of the hostage situation. He turned a considering gaze to the 2 women with him, and his sentiments only strengthened. While they had a decade on the young man, it was nowhere near the 4 decades he had on him. The next generation appeared to be in good hands, but would they be enough to combat a threat as dangerous as All for One? On the same token, would a threat as great as All for One ever pop up again? Overhaul was sitting at his desk parsing through the data he gathered from the experimental trials of the latest batch of quirk-erasing bullets they had been able to produce with Eri's blood. This batch had proven more promising than any previous batches, eliminating a quirk for an average of 12 hours. That was up from the max of 6 hours that he had been able to achieve previously. Things were progressing rather well in his opinion. Hopefully, with further experimentation, He could finally pin down a formula to achieve the permanent quirk factor elimination he was searching for. A diseased world finally cleansed of the sickness that was quirks would be within his grasp. Sir? A nervous man stood in the doorway of Overhaul's office. Ordinarily, no one, especially not anyone of any rank below that of the 8 bullets, would ever address the man in his office without knocking first. However, ordinarily, the door would also be closed for them to knock if they needed an audience with him. When the masked Yakuza boss looked at him, but did not speak, the nervous man took that as a cue to state his business and go. The haul of trigger you sent out Setsuno, Hojo, and Tabe to collect never came in, the man began to explain, but his boss' continued silence unnerved him even further. So we sent out a search party to check up on T then, and... The man trailed off, now sweating bullets at having to deliver the news to Overhaul. The fact that the man hadn't spoken or made a move even once since he arrived to speak to him wasn't helping matters. The abandoned factory they were producing in was completely leveled. The man finally was able to finish. There was dust and blue fire everywhere, and the cops and pro-heroes were already on scene. No sign or word from anyone in the family, and the trigger was already confiscated by the cops. The man only soldiered on at the continued silence from Overhaul. The early news coverage didn't say anything about a hero fight or trigger bust, so we assumed that it was a rival group or maybe some opportunistic villains. The man did not get to finish as Overhaul practically teleported from behind his desk to right in front of him and splattered the man across the floor and walls outside of his office. Overhaul maintained his blank gaze as he stared down at the mess of gore that used to be his henchman. "You didn't knock," he reprimanded out loud to the very, very dead underling before walking back into his office with a command to anyone in earshot to clean up the mess. "So, it appears someone is waging war with the Shy Hasakai," Overhaul muttered as he sat back down in his chair. "Dust and blue fire, huh? How annoying." Inko sat back down on her couch, substantially more exhausted than she was earlier. She had finished her conversation with Nezu about her discovery of Hawk's Feather, and the Chimera had spent 15 minutes talking her down from hunting the wing hero down and liberating him of his kneecaps. They couldn't afford to be so rash. The Commission had clearly made a move against them, and they couldn't be certain as to when. They were already planning a strike against the Commission with Endeavor's situation, but as of right now, the Midoriya home was pretty much compromised. Fortunately, Nezu already had plans for the construction of dormitories for UA students that lived too far to comfortably travel and had to move or get an apartment closer to the school. He'd have Cementos expedite its construction in order to get the Midoriya family to a more secure environment. Meanwhile, they would continue planning, gathering allies, and putting pieces in place for the downfall of the HPSC. Then they could liberate Hawks of his kneecaps. For the time being, Inko was both stressed and exhausted, and she just wanted to see her son, so she opted to video call him. He picked up after a few rings, and Inko was greeted with the sight of her son's bandaged face sporting a very sheepish smile. "Hey, Mom." Inko was only mildly alarmed by her son's clear injuries. He was tough, and he could heal himself if necessary, but what the hell happened to put him in that state? "Honey, are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine," he assured. "I just got a little banged up dealing with Murphy's Law." Her brow furrowed. What exactly happened? She watched her son nervously scratch the back of his head, so she already knew that she wouldn't like the answer. Hee, funny story. "Hold that thought," she interrupted before casting her Chinese evergreen a glance and standing up from the couch. "It's a little stuffy in here, so I'm gonna step outside for some air." She idly noticed her son giving her a curious look, and she knew that he wasn't going to like the news one bit when she told him. She wouldn't worry him while he was on his trip. "Okay, what happened?" she asked after shutting her front door and walking away from the apartment. Well, the I-Expo was attacked by villains." Inko stopped in her tracks and fixed her son with a look of concern. "Excuse me?" Some guys hijacked the island's security system and tried to hold everyone hostage while they stole some really valuable tech and research. Tried? May have intervened. Inko gave him a flat look. Izuku. All of the pros were trapped and restrained, even All Might. They literally couldn't do anything without risking innocent lives. We were in a position to help without putting lives in danger, so we did that. We. Me, Ochako, a few others from my class, Mei Hatsum from the sports festival, and Melissa Shield. In other words, no one with a license, she sighed. People are free to use their quirks as they please on Island, provided it isn't for criminal activity, Izuku responded. From what I understand after the police spoke with me a little while ago, vigilantism isn't technically criminalized on the island, particularly since there isn't ever any crime for regular people to stop. So, you skidded by on a technicality once again, she chuckled. I suppose, her son chuckled along with her. It helped that Mirko and Rukyu showed up at the end for a Deus Ex heroine. They beat that guy into the ground. Inko frowned. Was that guy in question the one who did all this to you? Oh, no, Izuku hastily assured. These injuries are all self-inflicted. Inko stared blankly at the screen, and her son began to sweat under her gaze. He coughed and cleared his throat, deciding to explain further. I sort of lost control of my quirk, he muttered. How? She pressed. A new color, Izuku answered before briefly looking away from the screen to hide his shame. A bad one. Inko, of course, picked up on that movement, and she frowned in concern. Sweetie? I'm okay, though, Izuku quickly spoke up to move on from the topic. Just need some more time with my healing flames, and then I'll be good as new. What's going on back home? How's everything going? Inko wasn't fooled by the attempt to change the subject, and it worried her even more. However, she would let it rest for the moment and allow Izuku to enjoy the rest of his trip. She could press for more information when he got back home. With that in mind, the answers to the questions he asked would worry him should she respond truthfully. She knew that he wouldn't react very well to the news that the HPSC was attempting to surveil them. Everything's fine, she finally answered. You're okay, so I'm okay. Inko could see in Izuku's eyes that he caught the way she dodged the question, and she internally cursed how sharp the boy was. She was relieved that he didn't press the issue either, though, and he only offered her a bandaged smile. What's the time difference between Japan and Island? Inko asked, half in an effort to change the subject again and half out of pure curiosity. Honestly, Izuku began with a hum. No idea. I don't even know where in the Pacific we even are right now. This whole island is powered by plot. Don't think about it too hard. I'll try not to, she replied with a snort. I'll leave you to get some rest. You need it. Okay? I love you, Mom. I love you, too, Izuku. Are you serious? I missed all of that. Tensei Ida was beside himself. When the island's security protocol had lifted and foot traffic was allowed once more, Tensei considered leaving the hotel to check on his brother. However, keeping up his cover was important to keep certain bureaucrats from asking unwanted questions. So he stayed in his room and was mildly reassured by the texts he received from his brother when the island's cell reception finally returned. Only when Tenya returned and informed him of what actually happened did he understand the true enormity of the situation. Needless to say, he was rather nettled. Do not despair, elder brother, Tenya tried to placate him. We defeated the evildoers, and everyone made it out safe and mostly unharmed. No, I figured that much, Tensei waved off. I'm upset that I was cooped up in a hotel room with no TV or internet while there was prime villain butt to be kicked out there. Do you know how long it's been since I kicked a strong villain after a recipro burst? Tenya stood with an utterly incredulous expression before he sighed and his eye began to twitch. As tactless as ever, elder brother. You know it, Tensei chuckled before sitting on the bed. How's Midoriya? Tenya's expression became slightly solemn, surprising the older Ida hero. He sustained numerous injuries in his battle with the leader of the villains. He assured us that they were self-inflicted after he lost control of his quirk and that he could heal them himself, though. "Wow, that's rough," Tensei remarked with a frown. "He seemed to have really fine control over his fire from what I've seen. I wonder what happened to make it slip." "I wonder that, as well," Tenya agreed. "I can't imagine what could have pushed him so far, and he was very hesitant to reveal many details." "Well, I suppose we can just be glad that he alongside everyone else made it out all right," Tensei sighed before turning a smile back towards his younger brother. "Now, tell me about these villains and how far you kicked them." Izuku had taken his mother's advice and gotten more rest. The burns incurred from the black flames were healing incredibly slowly, just as he expected they would, and the constant stamina drain of having his pink flames continuously active would probably kill him at some point if he didn't rest and eat intermittently. Several times he awoke to see Ochako sitting beside him, usually with food, despite his assurances that he was fine. That final instance of him waking up wouldn't be so pleasant, however. Enough time had passed for daylight to be breaking through the window of his hospital room, so he knew that it was at least the next day and the Eye Expo had officially begun. Sitting next to his bed wasn't Ochako, though. It was May, but she was busy napping as well. He chuckled and snapped his fingers in front of her face to wake her, jolting her awake with all the spastic glory that only she could provide. When she finally laid eyes on him, he could see relief and genuine happiness on her face. "Human Torch, you're awake," she cheered. "That's a new one," Izuku laughed. "How's the expo been?" May's face quickly lost its levity, and she became pensive. "The expo is mostly proceeding on as planned with a few exceptions." "You're making it sound like there's a lot more to this than just the villain attack," Izuku cautiously probed. "David's shield was arrested," May replied. "What?" Izuku exclaimed, practically hopping out of his hospital bed. "Why? What the hell happened while I was out?" "The villain attack was an inside job," May began to explain, and Izuku's eyes nearly shot out of his skull. "Apparently, the professor and his partner hired a squad of actors to stage a heist so that they could retrieve a powerful device and research that their bosses forced them to scrap." "Are you serious?" Izuku asked incredulously, and she nodded. "What device could possibly be worth attempting something so comically stupid?" "A device that amplifies quirks," May responded, and Izuku went pale. "It's basically Trigger without any of the harmful side effects. He wanted to extend All Might's time as the symbol of peace. It was a whole thing." Izuku sat back onto his bed and preemptively massaged his temples for the headache he could already feel coming. He just knew that he would be incredibly annoyed by whatever outcome resulted from this mess. "The problem was that the actors weren't actually actors," May continued, and Izuku felt his headache gaining strength. "They were real villains who had every intention of stealing the invention, and they were legitimately holding the island hostage to accomplish that. So, Professor Shield and Mr. Abraham were arrested for conspiracy and attempted theft. Then?" Izuku hazarded a guess. "Not exactly," May hesitantly denied, and Izuku did not like where this was going. "I only know because I was with Melissa when it happened, but one of the guys was only masquerading as a hired villain. I don't know if he was working alone or if he was colluding with another party, but he attacked Shield and Abraham and then left with the device." She went silent for a long moment before she hesitantly spoke again. "Abraham didn't make it. Shield accepted responsibility for it, as well as for the device being stolen." Oh dear," Izuku lowly remarked. He was truly at a loss for words. The shitshow had become a shit motion picture. "And the expo is still going on?" May's face screwed into one of disgust as she nodded. It was likely a financially motivated decision given just how many important and wealthy institutions either attend, fund, or have some sort of stake in the expo. "I don't have any actual details on that, though." Again, I only know as much as I do because I was with Melissa when it all happened, and we were questioned together. I can only speculate beyond that. So, a man is dead, Izuku slowly uttered, and one of the island's premier scientists and inventors is held responsible. But the show must go on in spite of the scandal in the interest of not losing money. Like I said, no actual details on that, May answered with a tired sigh. We're pretty much on the same page, though. The two sat in silence for a lengthy minute and marinated in the insidious implications. Shit motion picture truly did not even begin to cover the situation, after all. The man who did it, she quietly continued while fixing Izuku with a look of concern. He knew my name. He knew exactly who I was. That certainly took the boy by surprise. What did he look like? He had straight, red hair and violet eyes, and he was kind of tall, but everyone is tall to me, May answered. Izuku's eyes hardened at the description. It couldn't possibly be the same person from the mall, could it? He needed to be absolutely sure. Did he have a lackadaisical yet entirely too threatening air about him? Izuku pressed. Yes, very much so, May nodded. Shit, it is the same guy. Just who the hell is he? He put that out of his mind to think about later. How's Melissa taking it? May silently mulled the question over for a moment. She's handling it as best as anyone could in her situation. All Might has stayed by her side, so that's probably helping. Where is she? He asked. She sequestered herself in her lab at the academy, May answered. That's actually why I'm here. She gave me her ID to come in and out of the building, so I thought it would be better to come get you once you were discharged. Your interpersonal skills are substantially better than mine, so you'd be better suited for comforting duty than me. You give yourself too little credit, you know, Izuku remarked, even though she wasn't wrong in the slightest. May just shrugged. I know where my strengths lie. I suppose inventing and improving support tech is easier than dealing with the inherent volatility of human emotions, the greenhead mused while laying back into his bed. That, she nodded, and babies tend not to disappoint you. If they do, it's because you probably did something wrong. People, on the other hand, just try to make you believe that's the case. That was a much more cynical outlook than he would have expected from her. He considered probing further for more insight into that, but one of the doctors that was monitoring his condition entered the room. It wasn't long before he was officially discharged and on his way to the Island Academy to check on Melissa. When the two arrived to her personal lab, they found her hunched over her table and entrenched in one of the gauntlets of the crimson power suit she had created. She didn't look up at them when they entered, only throwing up a haphazard wave before returning to her work. Izuku idly noted that All Might wasn't in the room with her, meaning he probably left to get food or something. When the two approached her, Izuku got a better look at the haggard girl. Her hair was a mess, and that was even discounting the few clumps of it that were strewn about the floor of the lab. Her eyes were red and had more bags than Yayurazu after a particularly fruitful trip to the mall, but they were still laser-focused on the gauntlet she was working on. May and Izuku threw a glance towards each other, and they silently sat down across from her while she worked. Without a word, Melissa slid a set of schematics and notes over to May, and Izuku noticed that her knuckles were bruised. As May put on her goggles and grabbed the other gauntlet, Izuku looked around the room, and his eyes quickly landed on the bits of broken glass on the floor. Beside them was the smashed remains of the frame that held the photo of Melissa and David. He turned back to the blonde and noticed that every so often, her hands would twitch while she was working, and her subtle flinches whenever they did told him that she was in pain. He reached over with his palms bathed in gentle, pink fire, and he hovered them over her own. She paused but didn't look up, allowing him to use his healing flames to mend her bruised knuckles and restore her hands to an unblemished state. When he was finished and retracted his hands, she did not return to working on the gauntlet, instead sitting in choked silence. Tears started to trail down her cheeks, but she swiftly wiped them away. She paused once again when she felt a hand on her shoulder, though, and she finally brought her watery gaze up from the table to see a kind, warm pair of green eyes staring back at her. She turned her head slightly, and May had removed her goggles and was also giving her a reassuring look. Melissa gave the two a small, genuine smile, and she slid another copy of the schematics and her notes to Izuku. White flame bloomed in Izuku's hair while he looked them over, and the three silently worked on the gauntlets together. Nary a word was uttered among them, but nothing needed to be said. In that moment, a solid understanding blossomed between the three. Baby-making could bring anyone together through the toughest of times. Overhaul was a businessman, but more than that. However, he was a man of science. As such, the super-powered society entrenched in sickness that resulted from the development of quirks was inherently incongruent with how he believed the world should function. With that in mind, he could still find it in himself to do business with the diseased in the interest of practicality. To Overhaul, the ends always justified the means. If he needed to manufacture the very compound that boosted the sickness he sought to destroy in order to artificially inflate demand for a counter to that drug, he would do so and then capitalize on that demand maliciously. If he needed to continually tear apart and reassemble a 6-year-old girl in order to create that counter, he would gladly do so. It was all for a world free of the disease of quirks ruled over by the Yakuza, of course. All of that being said, it would come as a surprise to no one that Overhaul did not take encroachments on his operations lightly, especially at a time where the development of his cure to the sickness of quirks was drawing ever so near. A group of filthy degenerates attacking one of his trigger operations was unfortunate enough, but under normal circumstances, he could just have some of his men locate them and deal swift justice without him having to spend any of his own energy on it. This was not a normal occasion. Not only was the trigger operation attacked, but a third of the 8 bullets were killed in the process. Finding downtrodden saps that he could manipulate into pledging loyalty to him while also being competent enough to be useful was rather annoying, but they could inevitably be replaced. However, the insult of attacking the shy Hasakai so brazenly could not be overlooked, and retribution would be had. So, what was Overhaul to do? Well, on such deserving occasions, he'd opt to make an appearance among the degenerates in question himself, upon which he'd personally slaughter each and every single one of them. Then, he'd reassemble one of them to get the message across to never cross the shy Hasakai again, hopefully spreading the word to the rest of the roaches skittering about the criminal underworld. Let it be known that Overhaul was a firm believer in every action garnering an unequal and excessive reaction unless there was potential business to be done, but no such business would be done here. As he calmly sat at his desk and continued comparing his findings from the newest batch of his quirk eliminator from the last one, the young man had already sent his hounds out to sniff out any and every bit of information they could find on the lead they had as to the identities of their attackers. Blue flames and dust seemed like long shots at first glance, given the unfathomable quantity of quirks in Japan's monstrous population. But he wasn't the youngest Yakuza boss in Japan's criminal underworld for no reason. With his very expansive network of informants, many of which would likely have to be persuaded to cooperate, he was certain that he could suss out a man that wielded blue flames and a man who could render entire buildings to rubble. Those quirks, repugnant infections they may have been, were exceptionally powerful, and anyone casually boasting that kind of power would not be able to hide from Overhaul forever. No one could. The next few days came and went, and the Eye Expo reached its final day. Izuku had wanted to forego the festivities and stay with Melissa, but she insisted that he shouldn't deprive himself of the experience for her sake. He tried to fight her on it, but she was vehement that while she greatly appreciated his concern and would consider him a great friend without question despite only meeting him that week, she wasn't a damsel in distress, nor was she a fragile, porcelain doll that needed to be handled with the utmost care. He stood his ground, though, knowing exactly the toll being alone with your thoughts could take on someone after any length of time. Needless to say, the back and forth got a little heated, and tempers mostly Melissa's given her already tenuous emotional state flared when neither party backed down. Fortunately, cooler heads would ultimately prevail, and they eventually came to a compromise in which Izuku would split his time between the expo and hanging out with her so long as he brought her food whenever he returned. Izuku would also explain away the black eye he had by saying Mirko tagged him during another impromptu spar. Meanwhile, David Shield's name was dragged through the mud over the course of the week. There were a litany of angles he was getting attacked from in the coverage of the scandal. In one angle, he was painted as the orchestrator of a terrorist attack with the goal of stealing dangerous technology out of anger of having his work shut down for the greater good. In another, he was displayed as a scorned, mad scientist attempting to take his ball and go home after ruining the Expo, and the expo continuing on in spite of his failed attempt was just a refusal to bend to villainy. Not a lot was reported on what was actually stolen, and the reporting left it very ambiguous as to whether anything was stolen at all. It made sense to Izuku if what Mei said was true. That quirk amplifier likely wasn't ever supposed to see the light of day in the first place, and advertising that a villain was able to infiltrate and escape Island with it would be the worst look imaginable. Just as well, it would indubitably spur a massive manhunt for the person group in possession of it by people on both sides of the law. When it was time to leave the island, Izuku and Mei found themselves on All Might's private jet once again, though it was without All Might this time. He had chosen to stay behind to continue shielding Melissa from the scandal and help sort out where exactly things went from there. At least, that's what he told them he was sticking around for. Izuku had his suspicions, but he let it be, especially after the almost tearful goodbye he and Mei shared with Melissa. The flight back home was a lot more subdued than the initial trip to Island. Most people would be much less excited to leave Island than to go, and that was partially the case for Izuku and Mei. But they were also understandably exhausted from all of the hullabaloo that they had to endure. It was certainly a trip to be remembered, both for all of the right and wrong reasons. "Hey, Izuku," Mei addressed him from her seat across the aisle from his own, drawing his attention from the window. "Thanks for inviting me to this trip. Venturing to Island was a dream come true, despite everything that happened while we were there." "You were the first person I thought of aside from my mom," Izuku replied with a smile, and then he took on a thoughtful expression. "I don't think I've ever heard you call me by my first name, though. Makes me feel special." "You've already been calling me Mei for a while now, so I figured I'd at least return the favor," Mei replied with a shrug and smile of her own. "I've never had many friends, and I think I can confidently say that you occupy the top spot in that regard." That admission truly warmed the greenhead's heart, particularly since he knew that she didn't often get sentimental about much of anything. He was really lucky to have been able to make such great friends in his short time at UA thus far. "Plus, I made a ton of connections with support companies the world over, and I also now have a wealth of ideas for all the super cute babies I can make," Mei continued with a manic grin, her more familiar gremlin behavior taking over once again. Izuku couldn't fight the fond chuckle at her antics. She really was one of a kind in so many ways. He'd make damn sure that Hatsum Industries took off by hook or by crook, and he'd have her along with him on his hero journey every step of the way. Redistro stood in his office in Deka, fondly gazing out of the window at the glorious city as he was wont to do. They were inching closer towards their ultimate goal with each passing day. Recruits and sympathizers were funneling in weekly as senseless villain attacks on civilians became more prevalent, and their already established forces were growing more competent by the day under Getten's heavy-handed instruction. The inevitable liberation of society was near, and it was clearer than ever. Not since his days as a gnome in his youth had he felt such clarity. A knock came from the other side of his door, and he smiled. That was the signal that his lieutenants had all arrived at the conference room, and the meeting he called for was finally upon him. Striding out of his office and down the hall to the room in question, he opened the door and saw his most trusted comrades sitting in their seats at the conference table. Curious, Skeptic, Trumpet, Getten, and Kusari were all in attendance, and Redistro took his seat at the head of the table. I trust you all know why this meeting was called, Redistro began, and each lieutenant nodded, having at the very least a rough idea of what had recently transpired at Island. Excellent. Kusari, showcase the device. The redhead complied and retrieved a large case from under the table, opening it for everyone to view. This is David Shield's quirk amplifier that is supposedly able to massively boost the capabilities of one's meta ability without the harmful consequences usually seen in artificial enhancers, such as trigger. Okay, we have the device, Getten spoke up from under his hood in his soft voice that betrayed the survival of the fittest Sigma grind set he touted. What exactly do we do with it? What exactly can we do with it? Asked Trumpet, the MLA's inside man in the political world of Japan as the leader of the Hearts and Minds Party. It's certainly a powerful tool, but it's only one. We can do nothing without the accompanying research that went into developing it, Skeptic spoke up. Unfortunately, that research was confiscated when the project was shut down upon pressure from several governments, Japan's included. So, in other words, you have it, Curious surmised with a deadpan expression, knowing how dramatic her comrade could be when flaunting his skills and intelligence. Of course, I do, Skeptic scoffed. Getting into their systems and obtaining the information was only slightly more tedious than slipping past US numerous firewalls unnoticed. So, we have both the device and the instructions on how to develop it, meaning we could potentially reverse engineer this thing, Trumpet surmised. And mass produce it, Redistro finished with a dark smile. The pieces began to fall into place for the other occupants of the table. If they were able to crack the code on a risk-free quirk amplifier, they could outfit their entire army with them and develop a nigh unstoppable legion of super soldiers. No one would be able to stand in the way of liberation. Not any heroes, not any governments, and not any standing armies or self-defense forces. Hell, not even a surprise collaboration between the symbol of peace and the symbol of evil would be able to stop them. The liberation of society truly was near. HN, came a low grunt from within the thick parka of Getten. Something the matter, Getten? Redistro asked. I don't usually agree with the use of artificial enhancements on principle, Getten calmly explained. It runs against our ideology of wielding our own power as we should and dominating with our own strength. The room was engulfed in a thoughtful silence at the surprisingly insightful take from the hooded man. Kusari, having long since abandoned his lazy masquerade for such an important meeting, set his sharp gaze onto their Grand Commander as he mulled over Getten's thoughts. The older man's eyes were closed, and he was slowly nodding, as if he had come to a grand realization through nirvana. You are not incorrect in your assessment, Getten, Redistro began, and he had the rapt attention of his lieutenants. The mission of our movement is the liberation of our natural gifts, and the proper cultivation of our natural gifts into powerful, efficient weapons so that we aren't reliant on filth such as trigger is one of our keystones. However, in our hands, this device is more than just a shortcut to power or a tool akin to steroids. It's a symbol. After taking a moment to ensure that he had everyone's undivided attention, he continued. This device is a showcase of our potential should society unleash itself of its shackles and allow its inhabitants to live freely and wield their abilities as they should, as is their right. This device will show us what society could be if only we would allow it to be, what it should be if only we are successful in our righteous endeavors. It potentially may not happen in our lifetimes, but such is the nature of revolution. Change does not happen overnight. Utopia takes time to achieve, and utopia is exactly what we will liberate our society towards, as is Distro's will. Based, Getten replied with a nod, and he, alongside the other lieutenants, placed their right hands in the liberation sign with their thumbs on their foreheads and their index finger pointed to the sky. Based, indeed, Redistro said with his dark, self-assured smile. How long will it take us to actually reverse engineer this? Curious asked, living up to her codename. Unfortunately, it will likely take quite some time, though much less time than it would take without the accompanying research, Kusari chose to answer. However, time is on our side in this situation. How so? She questioned, and Kusari smirked. Let's say, hypothetically. Please keep this one brief, Trumpet interrupted pleadingly, and the others all nodded alongside him. Whatever, Kusari huffed indignantly. Anyway, suppose I was fingered as the guy who killed one of the developers of that device and walked away with it. The first thing they will investigate is my connection to the League of Villains, so the heat will already be directed elsewhere. His smirk returned with an even more vindictive edge. What's more is that they will eventually stumble upon the League's connection to All for One, assuming they haven't already. He's enough of a high-priority threat as it stands, but the very idea of the symbol of evil hiding away in the shadows with a device that amplifies quirks is cataclysmic enough to warrant Hero Society mobilizing in full to eliminate him. All of their attention will be on ridding the world of the quirk thief and what remains of his empire, and none of it will be on us, Redistro added on to Kusari's line of thinking, and the redhead nodded. They'll be so focused on killing each other while we're left to work in peace, and whoever comes out of that will be helpless to defend against us once we are prepared to strike. Redistro let the moment breathe so that the weight of the misdirection set in for the other lieutenants, and they were all cognizant of the implications. Kusari, in particular, was very pleased with himself. Assuring a reliable red herring for the heroes while the MLA gathered their strength was a commendable feat, and he would revel in his self-congratulatory high for as far as it would take him. Redistro smiled and gave his lieutenants a final look over. Until that time comes, everyone, continue your work, Redistro commanded. We are making excellent progress towards the ideal society, and we can only go even further up from here. You all are dismissed. A few short days of rest for both his mind and body was all Izuku was afforded before he would be back on the move. Classes 1A and 1B were outside of UA and weathering the last-minute lectures about their training camp that Aizawa and Vlad King were giving them, respectively. When they were finished, his classmates fell into excited chatter about what their training camp would have in store for them, and he could certainly understand their anticipation. But he was content with very little excitement for the foreseeable future. Just as that thought crossed his mind, he noticed the pair of floating arms making their way toward him in his periphery. Knowing exactly who they belonged to, he didn't feel the need to do anything to stop their advance, and the hands snapped around his neck and lightly squeezed while shaking him. "You little bastard," the voice of his fellow green head growled from beside him, and he turned to send a smile to the floating head glaring at him. Her face then took on a very exaggerated look of hurt and betrayal. "You met Godzilla and lorded it over me. How could you?" she asked in an equally exaggerated tone. "I thought we were the best of bosom buddies, Midoriya. Green-haired royalty is supposed to stick together, not undercut each other." Izuku could barely fight his laughter while reaching into his bag and retrieving a notebook. He flipped to the page with Godzilla's signature on it, and he held it up for her to read. Upon seeing that it was actually an autograph made out to her specifically, her eyes widened and her arms went slack. She slowly grasped the notebook and held it with such reverence that anyone watching would swear he had handed her the location of the Fountain of Youth. "You are forgiven, Lord Midoriya," Takage eventually said with her sharp-toothed grin. "Glad to hear it, Lady Takage," he replied with a laugh. "That's Tyranokage to you, minion," she corrected with a playfully haughty tone. "My mistake, Your Highness," he placated with his hands up in mock surrender. "Come on, guys, the buses are here," Kendo shouted to her class, and Takage took that signal to flick Izuku in the temple and fly away with the notebook in hand. Izuku amusedly shook his head and walked toward his class bus. He did notice Mineta staring at him with the same look of reverence he had several times in the past, and he would finally admit that it was starting to weird him out a little bit. The mind of the shorter boy, meanwhile, was in the midst of a complete whirlwind. At the center of his thoughts was his class rep, Izuku Midoriya. He would consider the absurdly powerful teen a friend, and he hoped that the feeling was mutual, but he couldn't really be sure these days. He never really could be sure with anyone, if he was being honest with himself. Making friends wasn't as much of a struggle for him as allowing himself to believe that they were genuine and not secretly looking down on him behind his back. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Everyone looked down on him physically on account of his diminutive stature. That, in and of itself, was also kind of the problem. Sure, people were never cruel or particularly unfair to him, but they were often dismissive of his dreams of becoming a pro-hero. His small size and odd mutation quirk were biological hurdles for being respected, as most would immediately write him off to be the gag character that was good for little more than comic relief and occasional slapstick humor. His admittedly overzealous appreciation for the fairer sex didn't exactly help matters, either. It hurt to see the rest of his class think less of him in real time after the locker room fiasco. He knew that he went too far. It was a gross invasion of privacy that got another classmate hurt in his stead when he should have just had some damn self-control. Now, not only was he a short, weird-looking nerd with shoddy social skills, he was a creep on top of that. He just wanted to be cool. He wanted to be respected. He wanted people to finally look at him as anything more than a quick laugh. He wanted people to feel reassured in his presence, not repulsed or apathetic. He wanted to be like Midoriya. Ever since the day he met Midoriya at the entrance exam where the taller boy jumped in front of a robot attack to protect him and then collaborated with him to take down the remaining swarm, he was constantly reminded of the kind of person he wished he could be. He watched the greenhead practically stumble into being obliviously surrounded by female friends, the respect of his classmates and pro-heroes across the nation, and even a strangely devoted following of people online that talk about him on hero forums. Minta was even browsing through the dumb rumors about Endeavor being a bottom when people springboarded the conversation to Midoriya and his fire quirk. What the hell was even the correlation there? They weren't even halfway through their first year, and he was already everything Minta ever wanted to be. He was strong, likable, heroic, ridiculously smart, and above all else, he was respected. Minta truly just wanted to be respected. "Hey, grapist, get on the goddamn bus before I squeeze you into juice," Bakugo shouted out of the window of his seat at the only one a student to have yet to board. "Language, Bakugo," Ida could be heard shouting from inside. Class 1A exited the bus after about an hour of travel. Most had assumed that they were just making a rest stop to stretch their limbs and go to the bathroom. But upon being faced with an empty lot save for a single black car overlooking the wilderness and no bus carrying 1B in sight, confusion and suspicion began to spread amongst them. "You guys don't actually think we stopped here just for you to stretch your legs, do you?" Aizawa spoke up, gaining everyone's attention. Before anyone could respond, both the driver and front passenger doors of the black car opened, and two figures stepped out of the vehicle. "Your feline fantasies are here. Say meow," one figure, Mandalay, began in her red cat meets magical girl-themed costume. "Perfectly cute and cat-like girls. You can call us the other figure, Pixie Bob," continued in a blue version of the other's costume. Wild Pussycats," they emphatically declared together while posing amidst a silent, mostly confused Class 1A and a young boy behind them who looked like he wanted to be literally anywhere else. "Oh, you're Avity," Pixie Bob called out while making her way to Ochako after spotting her. "How have you been since the internship?" "I've been doing all right," she answered with a smile. "It's great to see you all again." Pixie Bob smiled, and then she smirked and bent to whisper to Ochako conspiratorially. "So, how's the manhunt? You've got quite a few lookers in your class. Better snatch 'em up before their eyes wander to a spry young woman such as myself." Young is a bit of a stretch, Ochako mused internally, not wanting to upset the woman. "Long time, no see, Eraser," Mandalay greeted the tired teacher with a smile. "That it has," he nodded before addressing his class. "These are two of the pros you'll be working with at the summer training camp. Uraraka, you interned with them, so you're already familiar. The rest of you, say hello. We own this whole stretch of land out there. Mandalay stated after all of the pleasantries, gesturing out to the surrounding forest. Everything the light touches is part of our kingdom. The summer camp you're staying at is way down there at the base of the mountain. Wait, then why did we stop all the way out here? Toru questioned. I'm afraid we both know the answer to that, Tsu dryly replied. Nah, that can't be right, Sato nervously chuckled before looking over to Ochako. Right, you're Araka? They're just messing around, right? Ochako did not respond, and she was sweating bullets from having come to the same conclusion and thinking about the week she spent in the beast's forest. Right, back on the bus then, Siro nodded, taking her silence as all the confirmation he needed to get the hell out of Dodge. The rest of the class quickly followed suit and rushed back towards the bus, but Pixie Bob landed in front of them, cutting off their salvation. The current time is 9:30 in the morning. If you're fast about it, you might make it there by noon, Mandalay declared with an entirely too joyful tone in the class opinion. Just then, Pixie Bob used her quirk to rupture the dirt they were all standing on and created a landslide down the cliff's edge. Kiddies who don't make it there by 12:30 don't get any lunch, Mandalay called out to the collection of dirty and rather annoyed students at the base of the cliff. Good news, though, since this is private property, you can use your quirks however you want. You've got 3 full hours to make it through. It should be plenty of time, provided you can survive the beast's forest. Good luck. Mandalay turned around and strolled back towards Aizawa leaning against the bus, while Pixie Bob happily created and remotely controlled an army of dirt monsters for the class to fight through. Don't you think you've got them on a pretty crazy schedule, Eraser? Mandalay asked her scraggly friend. Yeah, that's the idea, he nodded. We're hoping to get an entire second semester's worth of knowledge in them here. That's going to take an intense amount of work, but the rewards will be worth it. I'll say, came a young voice from around the corner of the bus, catching the 2 pros off guard. Poking their heads around the corner to investigate showed Izuku casually leaning against the other side of the bus, and he gave them a lazy wave when he looked at them. Sup? Midoriya? Aizawa questioned in utter confusion that was shared by Mandalay. Why aren't you with your classmates? More importantly, how did you get by me without me noticing? I figured out what was up the minute we got off the bus, Izuku remarked with a shrug. As for how I got past you, well, you know who trained me. Mandalay wasn't sure how to react to the green-haired teen. She landed somewhere between incredulous and impressed. Aizawa, on the other hand, was just kicking himself for not expecting something along these lines from his student. Well, I'll be on the bus if you need me, Izuku nonchalantly informed and turned around to leave, but he quickly found himself ensnared in his teacher's capture scarf and lifted off of the ground. He could practically feel the glowing, red glare fixed onto his back to ensure he couldn't escape. It was worth a shot, he sighed in resignation as Aizawa carried him to the edge and yeeted him down into the woods with his classmates. Damn problem child, Aizawa lowly grumbled, but both Mandalay and Pixie Bob could hear the fondness buried under the scuff. Who trained him? Mandalay questioned, now incredibly curious about the boy. Pixie Bob was also curious if for no other reason than the kid already being pretty entertaining. Heh, you wouldn't believe me if I told you, Aizawa answered with a smirk. Meanwhile, Class 1B had the luxury of riding on their bus directly to camp, completely oblivious to the hell their sibling class was enduring. The 20 students calmly and leisurely conversed amongst each other as the initial excitement for the trip died down over the hour since they left Yua. One of those students was Yui Kodai, sitting silently and gazing out of the window while Takage was beside her engaged in a rather spirited debate with their blonde friend in the seat behind them, Pony Tsunatori. Yui was only half listening, just following the conversation enough to know that it was about anime, but not enough to jump in and contribute at all. Instead, she was content with blankly gazing out of the window and enjoying the calm of the moving landscape as they slowly made their way to their temporary home for the duration of their training camp. She loved window seats. She really loved window seats. As much as her classmates affectionately called her a coutier, She could become a yandere in milliseconds if window seats were involved. She was taken away from her window watching when her lizardy friend tapped her shoulder. "Yo, Yui, settle a debate for us?" the greenhead asked, and Yui nodded. "Awesome. All right, say you're fighting that old villain no one has ever been able to catch, Truck Kun, and he gets a lucky shot on you. But check this out, instead of dying, you get ice-guyed into a new world, but you're no longer human. Would you rather end up as a spider or a slime?" Yui took a moment to consider the question, and she placed her chin in her hand in a similar manner to her other green-haired friend while she thought it over. "Spider," she answered simply, much to the chagrin of the reptile fanatic and the glee of the class weeb. "Told you, Setsuna," Pony said with a victorious grin. "Ugh, why not the slime?" she groused to Yui. "I want to shoot webs," she replied just as simply. "See?" Pony remarked once more to the greenhead. "It's exactly as I said, bitches love Spider-Man." Yui nodded before returning to her window watching. Setsuna huffed, but conceded nonetheless. The mention of Spider-Man brought her to another thought, though. "Yo, Pony, you've been in Japan for a few years now, right?" When Pony nodded, she continued. "Now that you're settled in, how different is it here than in America?" Pony hummed and thought over the question. "Well, America is definitely a lot more open about quirks and quirk use than Japan. Quirk laws are a lot more stringent here. In America, you could just use your tail or even sprout a tree root from your gut to carry your groceries, and no one would really bat an eye. That isn't the case in Japan. Over here, you need a permit to do much of anything with your quirk as well as a license for hero work." "You don't need a license for hero work in America?" curiously questioned 1B's mushroom girl, Kanoko Komori, sitting beside her. "No, you do," Pony answered. "You just don't necessarily need a permit to use your quirk on the job so long as you're licensed for whatever job that is. Quirk use is kinda tied to freedom of expression in America, and that's a whole political can of worms over there. Nothing is ever agreed on when constitutional rights are brought up." "Not gonna lie, that sounds a little freeing," Setsuna sighed. "I guess," Pony mused. "It's not always a good thing, though. Vigilantism is a lot harder to pin down over there. Unlicensed hero work is one thing, but using your quirk in self-defense or the defense of others in public won't get you arrested or fined." She paused, and her hand went to her chin in thought. Unbeknownst to her, several of her classmates had begun listening to the interesting conversation. "Actually, you might get a fine, but it'll probably only be for disorderly conduct if you're being reckless about it." "Still doesn't sound so bad," Setsuna mused. Pony shrugged. "It leads some people to do stupid and irresponsible things more often than they should that end up getting themselves and others hurt. It all just comes down to cultural differences, though." One of the students listening intently to the conversation was the beastly intellectual, Jiroda Shishida. His attention was captured when Pony explained the stark differences in philosophy regarding quirks between America and Japan, and his attention was only stoked even further when she revealed how much more laissez-faire both the law and public perception was with quirks in the West. It made him curse just how needlessly restrictive Japanese society was in many regards, quirks being chief among them. How he wished he could throw his posh, well-mannered upbringing aside and embrace his beastly urges without the sort of public scrutiny given to heroes like Hound Dog and Shishido. Liberation will be upon Japan soon enough, he mused to himself. On the subject of cultural differences, Pony continued with a slight frown, I've noticed that people with heteromorphic mutations are treated a bit differently here than over there. Personal experience? Setsuna asked with a frown of her own. A little bit, she nodded in response. It might just be because heavy mutations are a lot more visible in America. There are a ton of mutant pride movements that people are mostly fine with, but there isn't a lot of that over here. While the two friends discussed the differences between Japan and America for better and for worse, Shishido wasn't the only classmate listening. Shihei Kirwaro was conveniently seated right behind the object of his affection, Komori, so he had also caught the conversation by proximity. However, the pitch-black-skinned teen was in deep thought for very different reasons than Shishida. The portion of the conversation about mutant discrimination in Japan stuck with him. He thought about his older cousin and the tragedy that was her life if he could indulge in being theatric for a moment. She had a hereditary mutation that was mostly independent of her quirk, but a mutation was a mutation nonetheless, especially in the rural area she lived in, since those were notoriously less tolerant of mutations than urban areas. Combine that with the fact that her quirk was very similar to his own, and you get a disgruntled mutant with a villainous quirk fighting back against vicious bigotry. It was only a matter of time before something really bad happened, and when it did, she ran away from home. He hadn't heard anything about her since then. His parents didn't often like to talk about her, but he refused to just forget. She was his cousin, and he had fond memories of hanging out with her when they were younger. He even chose his hero name, Vantablack, to pay homage to her memory. He'd find her one day, wherever she was. Many hours later, 1B had long since made it to the camp and had gotten settled in. 1, however, was not so fortunate. After 8 hours of trekking through the beast's forest and fighting through scores of giant, ferocious dirt monsters, the absolutely haggard class dragged themselves out of the tree line and fell to the ground at the feet of Pixie Bob, Mandalay, and Aizawa. That took longer than expected, Mandalay mused with a smile. You said it would take 3 hours, Cyril whined while laying bonelessly on the dirt. I guess I estimated it based on how long it would take us, Mandalay sheepishly but not very apologetically responded. I thought it would take even longer, Pixie Bob piped up in excitement. You kids did much better against my dirt monsters than I thought you would. You guys were seriously great. She focused her gaze on Izuku, Ida, Bakugo, and Shoto in particular and practically purred. Especially the 4 of you. It seems you've had quite a bit of experience already. She licked her lips, and Izuku felt a shiver run up his spine. I call dibs on these kittens. I'll groom them myself, she called out while leaping forward to harass the boys in question. You really ought to be on a list, Aizawa internally sighed, her antics reminding him way too much of Nimiri when she was feeling especially eager to mess with her students. Back in Musutafu, Inko felt a disturbance in the force. Her instincts were telling her that her baby was being harassed by a harlot, but when she snapped her gaze away from the cards in her hand, Midnight was still sitting to her left at the table they and 3 others were at. She narrowed her gaze at the younger woman, and Midnight began to sweat. Why you okay over there, Inko? She hesitantly asked the woman that was bearing a threatening aura. Someone is getting too fresh with my son, she answered. I can feel it. The 2 other occupants of the poker table, 13 and Recovery Girl, both snorted in amusement. Ladies' night was already off to an entertaining start. When Izuku had managed to free himself from Pixie Bob's attention by ensuring Bakugo made the ultimate sacrifice in his stead against his will, of course, he noticed the young boy who had been silently glaring at them ever since they got off the bus that morning. Who's that? He asked Mandalay while pointing at the child in question. Oh, this little guy's my cousin's son who lives with us now, she answered. Don't be shy. Koda, say hi to everyone. You'll be around them for the next week. Koda remained silent and continued glaring at them all. Izuku stepped forward to the boy to greet him face to face. Hey there, my name is Midoriya, he kindly began while bending down and extending his hand to the younger boy. I'm from the Yua High Heroics course. It's nice to meet you. Koda still didn't respond, and he instead winded up and threw as hard of a punch as he could to Izuku's groin. However, he was taken aback when Izuku calmly and effortlessly caught the punch with his other hand, his smile not dropping for a single moment. Koda! Mandalay shouted in mortified panic, but she stopped in her tracks when Izuku spoke. You telegraphed your punch a little too much, Izuku commented, smile still not wavering. The best nut shots are like lightning, so a quick jab is the best way to go. Let me show you. Izuku, much to the confusion of Kota and the incredulity of everyone watching, proceeded to demonstrate several quick jabs for the boy and encouraged him to emulate the technique. Kota, not really knowing what to do, just absent-mindedly acquiesced and threw several sloppy jabs at the air in front of him. Only when Izuku manually adjusted the boy's form to help him with the follow-through of the punch to avoid him hurting himself did Kota snap back to reality, and he threw a much better jab. "There you go, just like that," Izuku encouraged, and Kota begrudgingly accepted the praise and threw a few more jabs. "Is that Emi's form?" Mandalay asked Aizawa, commenting on how reminiscent Izuku's footwork and striking was of Miss Joke. "Yep," Aizawa dryly answered before addressing his exhausted students. "Enough playing around. Get your stuff off the bus." Izuku nodded to his teacher and turned back to Kota. "You're starting to get the hang of it. Just keep working on it and you'll have a certifiable nutcracker in no time. When your opponent isn't expecting anything, don't give them anything to expect." Kota turned his glare onto Izuku, but it had considerably less heat to it than it did previously. "Whatever," he muttered before walking away. After a veritable feast for dinner, since it would be the only time the students wouldn't have to cook for themselves, one found themselves enjoying the hot springs afforded to them. One boy, meanwhile, wasn't enjoying the relaxing soak as much as he could have been. Minto was stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the other side of a mere wooden wall was a glorious wonderland literally ripped from his wildest fantasies. The temptation to manifest destiny was ever so alluring. However, a quick glance to the other side of the onsen showed the unblinking eyes of his class rep locked onto him. He nervously met the other boy's unsettling, green gaze, and the two stared at each other amidst the light chatter of their classmates. Minta turned back towards the wall, vaguely hearing the conversations of the girls on the other side, and he turned back to look at Izuku once again, but he was gone. Surprised, Minta looked around for where their class rep disappeared to, but he was nowhere in sight. That was until he looked down at the water, and he clearly saw two bright, slitted eyes, one yellow and one green, piercing right through him from under the surface. He gasped and shuffled back against the wall of the pool, drawing the attention of some of the others. "You okay, dude?" Kaminari asked him. Minta glanced back at the water, but the face was gone. When he looked back to the other side of the spring, Izuku was back in his original spot as if he had never moved, and no one else appeared to have noticed if he did. "Yeah, just thought I saw something," Minta mumbled. "You know," Kirishima began with a thoughtful expression, "I kinda would have expected you to have tried something stupid like climbing the wall over to the girls' side by now." "Haha, yeah, that would be pretty on brand for you," Ciro agreed, and several others chuckled at the thought. Minta forced himself to chuckle along with them, but it was hollower than he would have liked. "I guess I can't exactly fault you for that." The rest of the time in the onsen went without incident, but Minta was silent for the majority of it. It had been abundantly clear to him that the bulk of his classmates were expecting him to misbehave in the proximity of their bathing female classmates. Even Midoriya had been silently keeping a tight watch on him the entire time, black magic and all. As much as he would concede that he deserved it, it bothered him like nobody's business. He had solidified his place as the troublesome comic relief, and that wasn't something that he was going to accept. When everyone had left the onsen, gotten dressed, and started heading back to the cabins, Minta made up his mind. He sought out the one person at the center of it all, marching right up to the fluffy mop of green hair before the other boy could enter the cabin. "Midoriya, can we talk?" he asked him. Izuku looked down at his classmate, immediately taking note of the resolute face of the shorter boy. "Sure," he acquiesced, and the two walked a decent distance away from the cabin and out of earshot of everyone but Shoji should he be listening. When they felt they were far enough, Izuku stopped and leaned against a tree before motioning for Minta to begin. Minta took a deep breath and swallowed his reservations completely. "Teach me your ways, Midoriya." The two stood in silence for a brief moment while Izuku confusedly regarded him with a quirked eyebrow. What? Teach me how to be cool, he squeaked out, all of the nerve he summoned up to speak to Izuku quickly evaporating. Izuku merely bemusedly scratched his head before chuckling. I'm a hero nerd who mutters when he gets excited and writes down information about quirks into notebooks. I'm certain there are others you could go to for advice about being cool before me. You don't get it, Minta muttered, struggling to meet Izuku's gaze. People like you. People respect you. Our classmates look to you for guidance, even when they don't need it. They just value your opinion. Everything you say carries weight to people, not even just in our class, but in other classes and even the general public. You had the freaking crowd in the palm of your hand more than once during the sports festival. Minta was growing frustrated with himself the more he spoke. He was just gushing about Izuku in a manner that seemed like a perverse mixture of jealousy and hero worship. He violently shook his head to refocus his thoughts. All the while, Izuku meandered over to a nearby log. What's this really about? Izuku asked and sat down on the log to be at eye level with Minta. Minta noticed that there wasn't any derision, annoyance, or judgment in his voice, just curiosity and concern. He opened his eyes and finally met his friend's gaze. You're strong, you're heroic, you're practically adored, and you're respected. I want to be that. I want to be like you, Minta finally admitted. He looked away again, fully expecting laughter or contempt, but none came. When he opened his eyes again, he only saw Izuku looking back at him with the same concern, but with a bit more understanding alongside it. The genuine desire to help that Minta saw in Izuku's eyes emboldened him to speak again. I know I can't be strong like you, or endeavor, or all might. I don't want a one-to-one transformation into you. I just want to be respected. I don't want to be laughed at or be the butt of everyone's jokes. I want people to feel safe in my presence when I'm a hero like they already do in yours. Minta sighed, and Izuku could hear the weariness in the boy's voice. I just want people to take my dreams seriously for once. Izuku's silence remained as Minta finished speaking. He reached over and patted a spot next to him on the log, and Minta hesitated a moment before sitting down. I'm gonna level with you, Izuku began, holding Minta's rapt attention. You're already working at a deficit with your stature and appearance. It's challenging to respect someone that I could probably punt 100 meters into the woods. Tell me how you really feel, Minta grumbled. With that said, Izuku continued, you've already carved out a decent lane for yourself as it is. Getting into UA at all is no small feat, and getting into the hero course is another thing entirely. You've managed to stick around this long throughout all the villain attacks, extra shenanigans, and threats of expulsion from Mr. Aizawa. I'd say you're doing well enough in overcoming that deficit. Then why is it still so hard to be taken seriously? Minta questioned. You're a pervert and a bit of a coward, Izuku bluntly answered. When Minta's face screwed into a frown, Izuku raised an eyebrow. Did you want me to lie to you? But Kaminari's a pervert, too, Minta defended. Yeah, but he's normal-sized and conventionally attractive, despite being a bit of a dunce. He can get away with a lot more than you could, or maybe it's more accurate to say that you can get away with a lot less than he could, Izuku responded, and he placed a hand up to silence Minta's interruption. Yeah, I know, it isn't fair, and it sucks. But that is the reality of your situation should you choose to make being a pervert such a fundamental aspect of your personality. Minta looked down with a contemplative frown, knowing that Izuku wasn't wrong about anything he had set up to that point. The good thing is that it's the easier of the two to fix, Izuku spoke again, drawing Minta's attention. The other issue is a little trickier to address. Being a coward, huh? Minta sardonically mused before sighing in defeat. You're not wrong about me being one. You're not always one. You've come through when it mattered most. You just need to make that more of an expectation and less of a fortunate occurrence. What do you mean? What I mean is that if you want respect, you need to be less of this, Izuku said while broadly gesturing to Minta with his hand. and more of the guy I teamed up with at the entrance exam and the USI. Be more like the guy who had my back and I had his in the life and death fight against the Namu. Be more like the guy who guarded Sue with his life when she went down. Minta stared at Izuku with bright eyes, soaking in everything the green head said to him. Things were beginning to click. Being respected was possible, and he was already fighting that uphill battle to do it. He had just been putting up hurdles in his path that were even taller than himself. That would change from here on out. I want to be respected, Minta firmly declared. I'm going to be respected. I'm going to be better than I am right now. Put your hand over your heart and say it with your chest, Izuku encouraged, and Minta placed his right hand over a spot on the right side of his chest. That's not your heart, Izuku confusedly noted. No, it is, Minta replied. I have isolated dextrocardia, so my heart faces the right side of my chest instead of the left. Fascinating, Izuku mumbled before shaking himself out of it and refocusing on the topic at hand. Speak it into existence and then become it. Use this training camp to start being that goddamn hero that you've always dreamed of becoming. Be the man that's deserving of respect. You bet your ass I will, he declared while popping up from the log and pumping his fist in the air. He thanked the taller boy profusely for the talk and turned to head back to the cabin. But he stopped when another thought occurred to him. Hey, Midoriya, he began, turning back to face the other boy. Are we friends? Izuku raised an eyebrow at the question. Were you under the impression that we weren't? Minta smiled, and it was one of the first genuine, non-lecherous or devious smiles Izuku had seen from the boy. I'm glad to hear it. With that, he scampered back off to the cabin, newly invigorated with single-minded determination to prove himself to be the hero he always dreamed of being. Izuku, meanwhile, exhaled and relaxed on the log until he heard the light rustle of foliage on the forest floor. You did a good job with that, came the gruff voice of his perpetually tired homeroom teacher as he stepped out from behind one of the trees. How long have you been listening? Izuku questioned, wondering exactly when the man had popped up and why he hadn't noticed his arrival when he did. I heard the whole thing, he dryly answered, and he smirked at Izuku's incredulous expression. You're good, but I'm still a pro. Guess we're 1-1. Then, Izuku joked, I wonder who will get the tiebreaker. Don't get cocky, the teacher warned. You slipped by me once, it won't happen again. I will gladly accept the challenge. Good. Get to the cabin and get to sleep. Training camp starts in earnest at the crack of dawn. Indeed, training camp did begin at the crack of dawn. One sluggishly trudged to a clearing in their pea uniforms, only to immediately snap to attention when Aizawa addressed them. Today, we begin your training to improve your strength, he began. Our goal is to exponentially increase your skills so that you'll have no trouble receiving a provisional license when the time comes. This will allow you to face the ever-festering dangers lurking in the darkness without any legal issue. Aizawa pulled out a softball and tossed it to Bakugo. Give that a throw for me. Bakugo nodded and rotated his shoulder before doing as he was instructed with a magnificent boom. 709.6 meters, Aizawa read, and Bakugo smirked. It's an improvement from the 705.2 meters you started with at the fitness test, I guess, he finished, and Bakugo's eyes went wide, as did the eyes of most of the class at the minimal improvement. You've had a single semester at UA, and you've all definitely improved after your experiences, but for most of you, those improvements have been limited to mental acuity and technical skill. Your quirks haven't fundamentally grown much stronger since the beginning, though. Aizawa's eye twitched when he saw Izuku begin to raise his hand. Like I said, most of you. Izuku's hand fell back down, and Aizawa gave his students a positively vile grin. We'll be training you into the ground and making your quirks as powerful as can be before the week is out. It'll be the most grueling training you've ever gone through, so you'd better hope you survive. One collectively paled, and they just hoped that another bond of shared suffering could be forged from the coming torture and added to their already plentiful collection. Izuku, Aizawa, and Pixie Bob stood a good distance away from the others, tipping Izuku off that his training would both require a lot of space and likely get a little hectic. Seeing the mildly threatening grin Pixie Bob was sporting only confirmed his suspicions. Your quirk is incredibly multifaceted, so it wouldn't be feasible nor make sense to focus on several things at once and expect to make decent progress on any one thing, Aizawa began. With that in mind, you'll be focusing on the one aspect that I've noticed you've been neglecting the most, and that's the pyrokinetic nature of your quirk. Izuku's eyes widened at that, but he said nothing and allowed his teacher to continue. From what I've been able to see, you fight like an amalgamation of everyone who has trained or sparred with you in some fashion or another. Joke told me about the sparring you did with Mirko, and your mother mentioned that you gained inspiration from and sparred with Gran Torino. Is that the extent of it? Upon Izuku's nod of confirmation, Aizawa continued. That's all well and good, especially when developing your own unique fighting style, but one thing stands out between all four of those people. None of them have fire quirks of their own, so they can't show you how to properly wield one. Hence, you've been slacking on using your base flames as the weapon they are in lieu of the other flames. Since I don't have a fire quirk and Todoroki is busy, you'll be playing around with your base flames and getting a better feel for ranged combat. And that's where I come in, Pixie Bob cheered as multiple dirt monsters of various sizes rose from the ground around them. You'll be blasting these babies with all the firepower you've got, but you can't use anything else. Exactly, Aizawa confirmed. No green, red, yellow, orange, purple, or pink, just your kaleidoscopic fire. Izuku nodded and activated his quirk, bathing himself in the colorful blaze. I'll leave you to it, he said before strolling away to greet the incoming 1B. You ready? Pixie Bob asked the boy who had instinctively lowered into a fighting stance. Give me everything you've got, Izuku replied with a determined nod. You'll regret that, she purred before the dirt monsters attacked and converged onto him. Izuku's eyes briefly glowed a bright green as the flames of his quirk flared, and he sent a wave of colorful fire at a group of the smaller, faster dirt monsters. Predictably, they quickly crumbled at the attack, but even more were nearly upon him. He swung his other arm back to send a larger wave of fire at the newest group, and he dodged to the left to avoid a hit from one of the larger monsters. They were slower than the others, but he doubted they would go down as easily. After engulfing his hands with fire, he peppered another wave of the swarming little creatures with a spatter of fireballs before they could overwhelm him, quickly pivoting to blast an approaching giant in the face with a heavier wave of fire to subdue it. Just as he expected, it didn't go down right away, and even more giants were approaching from his flanks. He dodged another strike from the beast in front of him and quickly scaled the monster until he sat atop its head, much to the amusement of Pixie Bob on the ground. Izuku stabbed his hands into the monster and unleashed another wave of fire directly within it, taking it down with an inhuman wail as colorful fire shot out of its mouth and eye holes. Izuku did not stop for a moment, though, as he launched back into the fray to tangle with the other hulking dirt monsters. He concentrated a blast of fire on his palm before igniting and shooting it out, mimicking one of Bakugo's explosions on a much weaker scale to stun the beast while he backhanded a smaller creature that tried to sneak up on him with his other arm. Returning to the stunned beast, he shoved his arms into its snout and unleashed another large wave of fire directly within the creature to disperse it. It was at that moment, with his arms outstretched, that he noticed something peculiar. There was a slit going down his forearm starting a little past his wrist, and he could fairly see wisps of smoke wafting out of it. An inspection of his other arm showed an identical slit with smoke seeping out of it as well. He really wished he had Melissa run a scan on his body when they had the chance. Never take your eyes off your opponent, Pixie Bob shouted as a swarm of smaller creatures surrounded him and made to strike. Almost immediately, Izuku hunched and stretched his arms out to either side before spinning in place, unleashing the full breadth of his base flames, all the while in a visually stunning, rotating pillar of fire that swiftly eliminated the attacking horde. When he began to slow down, he wreathed his right arm in flames and slammed it into a final giant, unleashing another explosion into it all the while before he hit it with a final wave of fire to dispel it. "Very nicely done, kitten," Pixie Bob commented with a small applause. "Barring that one distraction, you handled yourself really well. Now, time for the second wave." Izuku exhaled a bit of smoke before re-entering a fighting stance. "Bring it." After a long day of grueling training, the 40 exhausted students were tasked with cooking their own dinner, to which they were given curry to make. Only Ida realized that it was another part of their training, as rescuing civilians encompassed catering to their physical and emotional needs, so cooking a decent meal from scratch, while exhausted, would go a long way in that regard. Izuku didn't really get the logic, but he went along with it, nonetheless. When the food was cooked and most were scarfing it down like there was no tomorrow, Mandalay was calling out for Kota to come eat, but he was nowhere in sight. Taking notice, Izuku made a plate for him and told the pro that he'd follow the boy's footsteps and bring him the food, to which she was grateful for. It didn't take very long for Izuku to track him down, but he was curious as to why the boy came up to a cliff overlooking the forest. "Hey, you ran off without eating," Izuku said, startling the boy. "Mandalay was worried about you." Kota scowled at the intrusion of the hero student in his secret hideout. "Not hungry. Get lost." As he said that, the boy's stomach growled in protest, nullifying his rebuke of the food and causing Izuku to chuckle. "The stomach never lies," Izuku quipped, much to Kota's rising agitation. "I brought you some curry." "I don't want it," he refused again. "How did you even find this place?" "Oh, I followed your footsteps," Izuku sheepishly admitted. "Sorry if I'm intruding on a special place you use to retreat from everything." That took Kota off guard. His young brain thought having a special hideout was novel to him, and he didn't think others were familiar with the concept. "You have a hideout, too?" "Well, not exactly," Izuku began with a scratch to the back of his head. "I didn't have a hideout or retreat per se, but I did have my mom to comfort me whenever I was feeling down or inadequate." This was not the right thing to say, as Kota immediately tensed and his face twisted into one of anger. Izuku, not noticing, continued on. "Granted, her training was often what made me feel down and inadequate, but she was still always there too." "Shut up," Kota shouted, and Izuku was taken aback by the outburst. "First, you bunch of idiots come up here to practice with your stupid quirks for your stupid dreams. Stupid names like hero or villain to just show off your powers and kill each other. And now you're just here to brag about having parents to care about you. It must be freaking nice." Izuku was floored by the outburst, and he immediately realized that he accidentally hit a sore spot with the mention of his mother. He tried to apologize for upsetting him, but Kota was having none of it. "Get out of here," the boy yelled with tears streaming down his face. "Go away with your stupid dreams and alive parents. I hope they're ready for when you die and leave them all alone." Izuku froze when the last sentence was uttered, and even Kota realized that he might have crossed a line, but he didn't back down and kept his furious, tearful glare on the teen. Izuku blankly looked down at the plate of curry, and he placed the plate down onto the ground in front of him. "I'm sorry," he softly spoke before turning and vacating the area, leaving Kota alone with the plate of food. "Ugh, I hate this. It's so not cute," Toga whined while fitting her mask on. "It was engineered for the black market from what I hear." The somewhat robotic voice of Mustard came from his gas mask. "You should be more concerned about whether they work, not if they look pretty." "I've heard that Detnerat makes support equipment to sell on the black market for villains and vigilantes so that they can field test them," Spinner spoke up as he approached the convening group. "Don't believe everything you read on the internet," was the swift rebuke of another arrival, Kusari. "How much longer are we waiting?" "Till everyone gets here," Dabai smoothly answered, and he saw the approaching forms of Magni, Muscular, and Moonfish. That makes 8 of us. We're just waiting on 2 more and the science project. I can't wait to see the worthy duo for myself, Spinner just about gushed. I can't wait to kill some stuck-up Yua kids, Mustard gleefully added. I'm with Shorty, I just want to break someone, Muscular growled from behind his mask and cloak. Let me loose, I'm already pumped up. Me-at, Moonfish growled in excitement. Shut your mouths, you murderous psychopaths, Dabai dismissed. Pot, meat kettle, Magni snorted. We wait until everyone gets here before we strike, Dabai continued, ignoring the jab from Magni. Then, we rip their precious sense of peace away from them and show them whose hands their lives are truly resting within. Toga, despite the discomfort of her new gear, was excited for the events to come. She'd get to see her Izuku again, and she could make him all cute and bloody again. And then, he could help her, finally rescuing her from the excruciating pain of existence or killing her so that she couldn't hurt anyone else. Wait, what? She didn't want to die. Yes, she did. She wanted to live freely for once. She wanted to enjoy life without restrictions or judgment. She couldn't do that if she was dead. And that was for the best. No, she'll find Izuku and spread her love to him, and they'll live happily ever after. End her suffering. The boot camp that was their training continued on through the next day, and it was just as grueling as the day prior. Izuku was again faced with taking on an army of dirt creatures using only his base flames, but he was also tasked with blasting and evading projectiles that were lobbed at him by Rieko Yanagi and her quirk. On top of that, the projectiles would periodically balloon in size just as they were about to hit him or shrink in order to pepper him with hits and distract him from defending against another attack. He knew it was courtesy of Yui, as she sent him a thumbs up ever so often as encouragement to continue defending. The long day eventually came to an end, and after everyone ate, the Pussycats thrusted everyone into a wondrous test of courage between the classes. Well, everyone excluding those who failed their finals and required remedial lessons. The 5 from 1A and Monoma were spirited away to an empty classroom to have their lessons in lieu of participating in the game. When the rules were explained, 1A was divided into pairs, but the odd number of students left Izuku without a partner. He didn't particularly mind, as that meant that he could spend more time brainstorming on how he would manage to sneak up on Mr. Aizawa in order to win the tiebreaker. Just as well, now that he was sitting and not preoccupied with training, he could also think about his interaction with Kota the night prior. He hadn't seen the boy all day, so he assumed that he spent it alone at his hideout. He could gather from his outburst that Kota didn't have his parents anymore, and his clear disdain for heroes and them leaving the people that care about them didn't paint a pretty picture. He hoped the boy was okay. Suffering alone wasn't healthy and could become really self-destructive if left unchecked. His mother was very clear with him about that. He sat quietly against a tree while waiting for his turn to go, but in the distance he noticed a plume of smoke lifting into the night sky. Pixie Bob sniffed the air and mentioned a foul smell coming from the direction of the smoke. Some of the students were speculating about the cause of it, but their musings were cut short when Pixie Bob emitted a pink glow and was yoinked into the tree line. Izuku's alarm grew when a figure stepped out of the trees with a large block firmly planted onto Pixie Bob's skull. Whatever one-liner the villain said went ignored by Izuku as he hopped to his feet, his mind only on one thing, Kota. The kid was alone somewhere in the forest, and he didn't wait for any orders or provocation to dart into the forest in search of him. Tiger and Mandalay could take on the villains, and his classmates were more than capable of handling themselves if worst came to worst. He trusted them with everything he had. Kota, on the other hand, would not be able to defend himself against a villain attack, and he was liable to do something stupid in his state of mind. Izuku would find him. He'd make damn sure of it. Meanwhile, Magni and Spinner theatrically stepped into the clearing to address the assembled hero students and one half of the Pussycats. How are you all this evening? You a high school? Spinner began his grandiose speech to his captive audience. We are the Vanguard action squad of the League of Villains. How long have you been prepping this speech? Magni joked. Too damn long, Spinner cackled. Then his eyes landed on Ida amongst the group of students. You there, I recognize you. You're the one self-righteous brat that attacked Stain and Hasu. Where's the worthy duo? I want to meet them. The practically frothing Gecko Man weirded out both the heroes present and Magni beside him. Enough of this, the enraged Tiger shouted. You criminals are just followers of a dogmatic murderer like Stain. That woman beneath you is a hero who's saved countless lives and is giving her all to push these young heroes to reach their full potential. She's looking for a mate but is otherwise content with her life. Tiger's tone progressively transformed into a feral growl as he spoke, and it was reaching its apex. What gives you the right to cut such a happy life short? Didn't anyone ever tell you that it's not a hero's job to be happy? Spinner maniacally argued back. Humanity is for civilians. Heroes are supposed to be above that. This isn't some fantasy world from a comic, you maniac, Tiger shot back. That's not how real life works. Oh, I'll show you how life really works. You fake, Spinner spat, drawing two swords from their sheaths on his back. He had initially wanted to repair his giant sword after it was damaged against those Yakuza weirdos, but Tamura smacked him across the head and told him to stop being difficult and just use regular swords. Tiger, I've informed everyone of the situation, Mandalay quickly reported. Trust the safety of the other students to Ragdoll. You and I will stay here and hold them back while the students return to camp. Class rep, you're in charge on the way there. Do not engage anyone. You got it. There was no response, and Mandalay turned her gaze back to the students in irritation. But the person she was looking for was nowhere to be found. Midoriya, Ida frantically looked around for his friend and class rep. Where did he go? Did anyone see him leave? Was he taken? That possibility put Mandalay even further on edge. Shit, Ida, you're in charge. Then get everyone back to camp. Ida was hesitant to leave without knowing the whereabouts of his friend, but he shakily nodded and complied, nonetheless. Kota looked out at the scene. It wasn't pretty. Blue fires raged across the forest that was already blanketed by a strange, pink fog. Kota had no idea what was happening, but it didn't look good, and as much as he resented living with 4 pro heroes, he still couldn't help but worry about their safety, especially Mandalay's. Well, would you look at that? An unfamiliar voice came from behind him, accompanied by heavy footsteps. Kota turned to see a massive man in a cloak and blank mask approaching him. I came up here to scout for a nice vantage point, and here I find someone who isn't on our list, he continued, the joy dripping from his voice in a manner that made the young boy sick. How fantastic! I get to play around a little bit before it's back to business. Kota was petrified in the presence of the obvious villain, and the villain seemed to realize and revel in it if his increasingly dark chuckling was any indication. By the way, I like that hat, the man said before lifting up his mask to expose a horrifyingly familiar face to Kota. I'll trade you for this dumbass mask they gave me. Standing before Kota with an insane grin and fake left eye was Muscular, the villain who slaughtered his parents. Muscle fibers began to grow en masse over his already beefy arms as he stalked toward the positively terrified boy. Kota wanted to run. He wanted so badly to get as far away from the man as possible, but he just couldn't move. His fight or flight response had clearly abandoned flight and opted for the third option, freezing, in its stead. Strangely, though, fighting hadn't been abandoned completely. As Kota watched the hulking serial killer approach him, he felt palpable fear, but he also felt anger. In fact, he felt more anger in this single moment than he had ever felt in his short life. The man who took his parents away from him was standing right in front of him looking to do the same to him. He wouldn't have that. You, Kota growled through tears, you killed my parents. HM? Muscular stopped his advance and gazed at the boy quizzically. You're gonna have to be a little more specific than that, kid. Water hose. You killed them, Kota shouted, now enraged that his parents were purely numbers to the man who killed them. Muscular stood in visible thought for a moment, periodically gazing down at the boy as if he was trying to match a face. Then, a light bulb shined above his head, and he remembered the duo. Oh, those two, I remember, now. That was a fun day. He turned his gaze back to a positively apoplectic Kota and shrugged. For what it's worth, I don't hold any hard feelings over my eye. I was doing what I wanted to by killing people, and your parents were just doing what they wanted to by trying to stop me. It just so happened that my desire was stronger than theirs. It's nobody's fault. That was Kota's breaking point, and like lightning, the boy threw a jab faster than Muscular could track. A simple jab at the air in front of him wouldn't ordinarily accomplish anything, but the jet of water that shot out of his fist and slammed into Muscular's crotch certainly did. The wail of pain that escaped Muscular's lips was music to the boy's ears. He reveled in the agony the man was experiencing, and he capitalized on the moment by throwing more jabs with water jetting out of them, smacking into various places on the crouching Muscular and doing even more damage. Muscular, meanwhile, felt like he got shot in the dick by a beanbag gun, and then he felt like he was being pelted by them even further. It was truly pissing him off. Enough, he shouted, and Kota felt all of the confidence and catharsis he had just been reveling in vanish in an instant. I'll tear you apart, you little rag. Muscular launched toward the boy, intent on pulverizing him into a fine mist, but a flash of yellow entered his vision before a foot slammed into the left side of his face. Kota was then spirited away by the yellow flash and placed on the other side of the cliff nearest to the path to take him back down the mountain. The boy looked up at the figure who saved him, and he saw Izuku standing over him in a golden blanket of fire. He didn't know if the utter contempt on the teen's face as he stared down Muscular was comforting or frightening. Oh, wow, ain't this convenient, Muscular mused. Our target just shows up right in front of me. You piece of shit, Izuku spat, ignoring whatever the man had said. Your voices carry on this mountain. I heard everything. You murdered this boy's parents and then have the nerve to say that you hold no hard feelings and that it wasn't anyone's fault. Heh, you seem to feel pretty strongly about it, Muscular said with a vicious grin. Tell you what, the little shit over there pissed me off, so I'm gonna go all out from the start. If you're feeling so froggy, then jump. He tore off his cloak as his muscles began to bulge even more, and his body eventually ballooned in musculature and burst through the tank top he was wearing. Kota was petrified at the sight once again, but Izuku's gaze only narrowed. Kota, he addressed the boy with steel in his voice, making the boy jump in fright. I can't ask you to head back to camp. It'll be too dangerous with the villains running around. I need you to get a good distance away from this peak and stay out of sight, though. I'll find you when I've put him down. Why, you're insane, Kota cried. You can't fight him. You'll die. It isn't a matter of whether or not I can do it, Izuku simply replied. As a hero, it's my job to risk my life to turn promises into reality in order to help people who need saving. I'm here now, and I'm going to protect you to my dying breath if necessary. That's what heroes do. No, Kota cried, but he was quickly ensnared by a thin, purple flame and tossed away from the immediate area. Enough chit-chat, show me your blood, Muscular cackled as he bounded toward Izuku with a grotesquely muscled arm ready to strike. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through What If Deku Unleashed Godlike Quirk That Surpassed All. I hope you found it as intriguing and thought-provoking as we did. A big shout out to DripBayless for crafting such a compelling story. Don't forget to check out their profile on FanfictionNet for more amazing works. The link is in the description below. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to What If Deku 2 for more fascinating explorations into the world of fanfiction and fantasy. Your support helps us create more content like this, and we're always excited to hear your thoughts and suggestions in the comments section. See you guys in the next video.